Hopefully my laptop doesn't overheat. The fans are blowing like crazy. First time I'm doing it on this. That's fine. Well, it's a new.
All right, welcome everybody. We're back with a debate review. We've been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm glad we finally made it happen. We have Kai, Lewis, Orthodox Shahada, and Dr. Beau Branson. Before we get started, I do have to thank the generous super chatter from the other night, Junior Gallo, who sent $300. Thank you so much for that. Evgenia 3P sent $5. Thank you so much for that. Junior definitely wins the biggest super chat in months. Anonymous $10. Thank you so much for that. Pointing out that eating meat and pushing us to eat bugs is a bunch of nonsense. What's the real reason that's being pushed? Well, I think that it has to do with, as Bertrand Russell and people like Charles Galton Darwin said, that you can control the population in a lot of ways, and diet is one of those key ways. So getting us off of having our own farms, our own means of subsistence, makes us then have to rely on some sort of centralized technocratic system. So thank you for those super chats, guys. I didn't want to leave you guys hanging. So again, thank you so much to Lewis, Kai, and Dr. Beau Branson today. We're going to do a review of the Jake debate. Kai has a lot of information and slides he's going to share. And I felt like, it went okay. There was a couple places I could have done better. I always feel like that, I guess, after a debate. But Dr. Beau and Kai and Lewis had a lot of good insights, a lot of good book recommendations and so forth as we prepared. So I want to thank those guys so much. And you in the audience, I think you're going to appreciate this because I had a lot of questions after the debate. A lot of people were unclear about certain topics that came up. A lot of metaphysical, epistemological baggage and terminology was mentioned. And one of the downsides of the debate was that we didn't really get to stay on certain topics and really drill into it. We kind of started maybe dancing around the edge of the topics and what the key issues were, and then we got deflected off into another topic. But that's just kind of what happens in debates anyway. It's just part of the nature of the beast. But Kai, before we get into it, we get into your slides, overall thoughts on the debate. What's your take?
Jay, you simply lost the debate because you didn't know what fitra means. Okay, just that's it. You lost the debate.
I like this technique. I want to start picking the most obscure term in Christian theology, right? Inhypostatized. And I'm going to ask everybody whether they can define it. And if they can't, then I'm going to declare myself a winner of every debate. So it's an interesting technique.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very similar to the comments that I had on the Hakikachu debate review with regards to that. Same thing with Jake. A lot of the stuff, that's what I was kind of anticipating he was going to argue from. And you'll see when I bring up my presentation slides how I understood his line of argumentation to unfold. Nothing really surprising. Honestly, it's just, I think everybody was waiting for this debate to happen. And we're glad that it did. It showed us the best that Jake has, which is basically nothing. And so I'm glad that it's over and done with. I mean, he'll probably do a debate review on this debate review and whatever, sort of like a review of this debate review. And
turtles all the way down. There's infinite debate reviews.
Yeah, exactly. And he's just going to do his own thing because he's there just to placate his audience. He's not really convincing anybody because the people who are convinced by his argumentations are less read than him. And so they're just going to listen to whatever he's saying. But anybody who goes and studies these sources, goes and learns epistemology and learns our metaphysics, they'll see that he doesn't really have any kind of argumentation of substance that he's putting forward.
And I'm glad Dr. Beau's with us too, because Dr. Beau was mentioned multiple times in the debate via some of Jake's comments. So, Dr. Beau, I don't know if you want to give your assessment or address any of the topics that were brought up in regard to your name.
Yeah, no, I mean, the main thing I remember is just, that he quoted me as though I was saying literally the opposite of what I was saying. So, yeah, he quoted like the, half or just kind of a snippet from like the abstract of my dissertation. If you just read like the next couple sentences, you'd see, well, the whole point of the dissertation was to say the opposite. At that point, I just kind of thought like, I don't know. I've just kind of decided I don't think that Jake is really very serious. You
Yeah,
know
I
what I
know.
mean?
So,
Like kind of
yeah.
like I want to sort of say something that looks good. Um, but yeah,
Sorry,
like
you guys can go ahead. If you hear me say something, I'm muted. I know you guys can hear me, but the audience doesn't hear me. So when
okay,
I'm over
okay.
here saying naughty words and cussing people out, it's the audience doesn't hear.
Okay.
It's just you guys.
It's muted. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean that was the main thing. I just kind of felt like it just demonstrated like that there's a kind of lack of seriousness about actually getting to the truth of anything, which is disappointing. But
Yeah, I think a lot of the clips that were taken, that to me suggested that I think that was really what he was after in the debate was a bunch of clippable sections that sort of gave the
Mhm.
appearance of, oh, he got owned in that 30-second clip. So I think that's what he
Right.
was after. Lewis, any comments before we get into Kai's slides?
No, I that's exactly what I wanted to say is that I think that he went in, he had his preset questions for the cross examination that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the prior presentations you made, just to get a clippable moment, basically. Um, and I think he did a very, very bad job of defending his position. I also think he didn't understand some of the arguments you are making. We can talk about some of that later.
Yeah, particularly I think the transcendental arguments section where he brought in Dr. Father Deacon Ananias's paper. I think there was a big bunch of misunderstanding there. He didn't seem to be aware of the basic problems for a strict nominalist position either. So yeah, a lot of things to hit. So we'll hit on all that here in a minute. One thing I'd like to address before maybe Kai gets started, and while Dr. Branson is here, one of the things that came up at the beginning about citing the Cappadocians was this idea of the essence of God being, quote, a universal. And Dr. Branson, and I'll defer to you since you are very well studied in the Cappadocians, you know them a lot better than I do. My understanding was just that when there's a comparison made between the relationship of the common and the particular, it's an analogy, so to speak, between the way that it works in the human realm and the way that it works in terms of the essence of God being common to the persons and the persons being kind of the individuating, particularizing character. So that doesn't mean that the essence of God itself is a universal, because first of all, we believe in apophatic theology, so we wouldn't be predicating positive attributions, to identifying
Yeah.
the divine essence as a universal. But perhaps you could, kind of clear that up and speak to what was the confusion there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think you'll see kind of sort of different views in different church fathers. So, um, I think yeah, my view as far as kind of the technical details go is probably Gregory of Nissa does sort of think about the divine nature on the like an analogy to a universal, but Gregory Nazianzen maybe thinks more of like what we would today call trope theory. Um, but also, I think you made a good point that like it's not clear, do you really want to say the divine nature like literally is a universal or a trope or something, or is it just kind of like this is the best way that human beings, are gonna understand it? And I think there's good reason to think it might be more the latter. I mean, sometimes when Gregory of Nyssa or other Cappadocians talk about it, they'll sort of say like they'll say language like if you think about it the same way, then you'll get the right results, or something. It's kind of like it's not clear they really mean to literally say that's exactly what it is. But and then I think some people, other later fathers, kind of have even more of that sort of language. But I think feel like there's to some extent like you can have some sort of slight variations on some of these things and still get the same result. So it just depends on kind of what the if there's a counter argument or something to be addressed. But I don't know if that really answered.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, there is kind of an evolution in the way Platonism and Platonic ideas are used. If you read the Zach Huber text, by the time we get up to John Damascus, things have kind of solidified in a certain direction that's somewhat different than the Cappadocians, but we certainly couldn't say that it is that, like in some sort of identification sense. I mean, that would just seem to be against all ideas of apophatic theology. But I don't know, maybe that's not where he was going with that argument. I wasn't exactly sure. Even if, to your point, there's variation amongst the church fathers to the degree that we make the comparison of one and many and universal in particular to the Godhead. I don't understand what that was supposed to prove in regard to Trinity versus Tawhid. But anyway.
At the risk of plugging my stuff, this book that's going to be coming out with me and William Lane Craig and Bill Hasker and Dale Tuggy, in my main chapter, I kind of cover that, like kind of how, what results would you get if you think about it as a universal or a trope or whatever. And it becomes clear in there, like, there are sort of different ways you could formulate the precise metaphysics and you kind of get the same results. So there's some room for variation on that, is the
point. Louis, Kai, did you want to go ahead and start your screen share?
Yeah, okay, we'll start that up. Just before I get the screen share, I just want to make a comment. So despite this is a debate review, I don't, me personally, plan on covering like every single point that was brought up in the debate review. There's one that really stuck out for me that I want to kind of cover in greater detail, because it's something that has been discussed from him for the past couple of years, that whole LPT issue. And this is, I think, a good opportunity for us to kind of really sit down and just really dissect all of this, and with the whole counting issue, and just demonstrate that he has no idea what he's talking about. Now, I do have several slides and I don't want to monologue this. And so I do invite everyone, like whatever I say something, just stop and let's go into free flow conversation, and just whatever you guys want to throw in. Like, I don't want to just kind of stay here for me talking for a long time here. Let me just share down. Okay. Do you see this? Okay.
See it.
So counting by division. So the idea here is like the Muslims make several claims against Christians. One, and this is pretty much the most forceful one that comes from Jake, is that counting should only ever be done by identity. And it's like, that's how everyone counts. If you introduce this notion of counting by division, well, him and others will say, well, this is just a modern invention. Nobody counts by division.
Yes, so just to butt in on that, I mean, literally the opposite is true. Like literally everyone from Aristotle up to like the 18th century would say like, yeah, mathematics is the science of quantity, and like the way that counting works is by division. Like it's a fairly modern development to think that you aren't talking about quantity, that you're talking about like structure or something instead. Even up until like, I mean, that it's started getting debated in like the 18th century, but even up into the 19th and like almost into the 20th century, you have people like John Stuart Mill still had he advocated a basically Aristotelian view about number, and it's like Frege. I mean, it's literally like Gottlob Frege in the, like late 1800s, like beginning of the 1900s, who like argued against, all of these previous views about number. I quote this at one point, like Bertrand, is this actually, Bertrand Russell, in Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, chapter 2, like he's, I just had to open up this page. It says the question, what is a number, is one which has often been asked, but has only been correctly answered in our own time. The answer was given by Frege in 1884 in his Grundlagen der Arithmetik. Although the book is quite short, not difficult, and of the highest importance, it attracted almost no attention, and the definition of number which it contains remained practically unknown until it was rediscovered by the present author in 1901. So it's basically like you're saying, like, 1901 is like ancient history, and then Aristotle up through that is like the modern view, which is, I mean, pretty ignorant of to take. Anyway, it's just kind of a crazy statement, because I know that people have said this, and it's it's just nuts. So.
Yeah. Thank you for
I'll
that. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So moving on, so without ceding any ground on terms of the counting by identity, they'll say that, okay, even though like the Muslims will say, no, we have to count by identity, but then they'll attack us for using different counting methods, and they'll say that, well, Christians are inconsistent in applying their counting methods. And so the example that they'll give is that count by identity when enumerating the divine hypostases, but then count by division when enumerating the number of divine beings. So you have 3 divine hypostases, but only 1 divine being. So there's a difference in the counting there. And that it ultimately culminates in the claim that we're switching counting methods to avoid saying there are 3 divine beings. And so the way this is related to the LPT. So I'm kind of going to just recast the LPT in the hypostasis divine being language. So the idea here is that you count a divine hypostasis by identity, and that corresponds to a divine being, counting by identity. And so in the LPT, you'll have that the divine hypostasis is God. God is a divine being. You have 3 divine hypostases, so you have 3 divine beings, but there's only 1 divine being. So there's your kind of LPT formulation right there. And then the accusation where we're switching counting methods is, well, you're counting divine beings by identity, but then you're saying that there's 1 divine being by division. And so Jake's whole polemic rests on this idea that this is some kind of an arbitrary switch.
Yeah.
So
I think that kind of came up during the debate, right? Because I think Jay kind of mentioned the distinction between like terms of first imposition and second imposition and all of that. But do we want to talk about that now, or do you want to go to the?
Yeah, I was actually looking for that paper where I'd taken the notes from that the paper written by the guy Anscombe, or I forget what it was, but it was the one talking, not Anscombe, the one talking about different modes of counting, and I'd taken some notes on that page because you were talking about the medieval distinction between first order and second order imposition. And to me, my understanding was that to help make this kind of clear was it's just sort of like different things are going to be counted in different ways by the nature of what they are, right? So if you have an abstract object, it's going to be different than a mundane object, so it's going to be counted differently.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much right. I mean, you could put in those terms like maybe abstract versus concrete. So different people in the history, like in the tradition, kind of formulate it in different ways, but it's recognizably like the same thing that they're getting at. So like Aristotle talks about quantity in the categories in chapter 6, right, in terms of division. So he said, you've got continuous quantity, which is like lines, surfaces, and solids, and time and space. And then you've got discrete quantities, which would be like pluralities, or what he calls numbers, a number of things. And the difference between continuous and discrete is just whether there's separation. So if you've got like a line, it's all continuous. You can talk about how big or small it is, or how long or short. That's continuous quantity because the parts of it are all kind of connected. But then if you break the line into 2, which is what we call it dividing it in 2, right? you've got a division where you've got the borders of it where it doesn't share, they don't share any boundary, they don't share any common part, right? So they're not continuous. So that's kind of how, Aristotle talks about quantity and talks about number. But then, of course, he counts things like the 10 categories, and 10 categories, these are genera of being, so you can't divide them spatially. So how does that work? Well, people talk about it in different ways. Those are terms of second imposition, or they'll talk about what they call formal division instead of material division, which just basically means counting by identity, that there's a form they don't have in common. A good book to read if people are interested in this in terms of kind of the modern, like, actual practice of mathematics and like contemporary philosophy of mathematics. James Franklin has a book, an Aristotelian realist theory of mathematics, I think is what it's called. And he goes through this. So like chapters 3 and 4 in that book are about, whether math is a science of quantity. He talks about quantity in chapter 3, and then structure in chapter 4, and talks about like kind of different attempts to sort of reduce one to the other. And basically at the end of it, he just concludes like you can't do that. You can't reduce structure to quantity, and you can't reduce quantity to structure. And different people have kind of tried to do both, but you can't. And that actually is, I mean, roughly, that's basically like Thomas Aquinas's position, is you have what he calls transcendental numbers, which is not the same thing, that not the same sense that we use that term today, but you have to have a way to be able to count things that aren't physical objects. And so when you're doing that, then you just count by identity, because if you're talking about abstract objects, or you got, yeah, there's certain things where, well, how else would you count them? So those, people will say, yeah, you count those by identity. But you can't really, you just can't do that with physical objects, because physical objects can overlap, or they can. So, if you had, I'll give you a few. I mean, there's a million of these kind of problems and counterexamples, but a simple one is just, let's say I've got a gallon of water, and let's say, I don't know what the numbers are, but let's say there's like 1 trillion water molecules in exactly 1 gallon of water, right? So I've got this gallon of water, and then I add like 1 extra molecule of water. Okay, how many gallons do I have? Well, if you're counting the way they say, right, you have to count by identity, and you're just counting like a big aggregate of water molecules. Well, if I've got 1,000,000,001 molecules of water, how many subsets of that are, how many trillion molecule subsets do you have? Well, you have 1,000,000,001 subsets that are each a gallon of water, right? But they're not identical, because each one leaves a different molecule out. So by adding a single molecule of water, you've all of a sudden got 1,000,000,001 gallons. I mean, that's a crazy thing to believe, right? Because most of us would say, well, no, you've got 1 gallon plus a molecule. You just got to, right? Because there's no way to divide that such that you get 1,000,000,000 discrete gallons, right? You can only divide it in ways where you get either a gallon in a molecule or something equivalent to that. So when the reality is just, when you are counting physical things, you have to count by division, or you just get crazy, insane results, right? But then when you're counting things like abstract objects, you can't count by division. So, if you want a way to count those, then you have to count by identity. And like I said, I mean, James Franklin kind of goes into more detail in the really kind of technical aspects of how mathematics works, why you can't reduce those.
I was just wanted to say that this gets into also, doesn't it, Bo, the whole debates about like divisibility of, like, when you were talking about the line and how you could divide the line like potentially an infinite number of times, like even like a physical line.
Mhm.
And like there was generally a view that like if you counted, or in my understanding is that if you count by identity, all those sort of lines, that infinite number of lines exist within that line, and so you'd also have to have this sort of weird situation where you'd have to say if you count by identity, then there's like infinite lines that exist like in a single line
Yeah.
on a piece of paper.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like just if I look over here at this little dash next to count by identity, you know, if I'm counting by identity, like how many lines are there? Like how many little line segments are there? Like a bajillion or like infinitely many, right? Because they're just all on top of each other, right? They're just all overlapping and they're different lengths and whatever. But I mean, no, they're just there's just one, right? Like there's just one line. They're not actually divided. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Liebes. Mhm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mhm. Right. Yeah.
Apparently you're muted, Jay. So you want to go from the beginning? Maybe get a new piece of paper.
Yeah, so basically, a piece of paper that was one post-it note, and if I had A and B written on it, we think of this as one thing. It's all, one collection of molecules together. But if I rip it in half, right, is it one or is it two? Because it's technically speaking all of the same molecules. We didn't get new molecules added to it. We're counting by division because we have two now. So this is a mundane object, a physical object that Dr. Branson had as a great example of something being counted now by division because it's two. Even though it's all the same molecules, it's still,
Yeah.
now it's two
Yeah.
objects.
The thing with
And
like,
critically, also those two bits that you pulled apart, they both were not identical prior
yeah,
to you ripping it in
Right.
half. So
right.
if you'd have to count, like again, we would say probably an infinite number, but in this case, let's just for simplicity's sake, if you only counted by identity, you'd have to say that there were two pieces of paper prior to them
Yeah,
being torn in half.
that's a great
Yeah,
point.
there was always two pieces of paper. They just happen to be stuck together. But by the same token, like right now, there's a billion different pieces of paper. They just all haven't been ripped up yet.
So we're into like Zeno's paradox of paper,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, the thing about it is like the way that they're talking about counting, right? The way that's kind of become popularized since Frege, all you have it's this is a little bit technical, but like in the logic of it, all you have to work with are quantifiers and the identity sign, right? So the if you want to say like, oh, okay, there was one piece of paper, now there's two, you either have to say something popped into existence ex nihilo, which is seems crazy. Like nothing came into existence when you ripped the piece of paper apart. Or you have to say something became like two things used to be identical, but now they're not. But that's a logical contradiction. Like it's a famous, like temporary identity is not something that's possible, right? Because uh, if you say something like X and Y used to be identical, but now they're not, right? Well, okay, X always has the property that it has to be identical to X. So if X used to be identical to Y, then Y had the property that it can't stop being identical to X, right? Just like X can't stop being. So you just kind of end up with contradictions when you try to say that things become identical or cease to be identical. And it's just not true that things like popped into existence ex nihilo. So there's not any good way to account for, things dividing and uniting over time.
One side point on this, excuse me, I didn't expect this, but in the last week I did a deep dive into Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, and of course Carroll was a Victorian era
Right.
mathematician. I didn't realize that as you get into the novel, a lot of the word play and the number play that goes on when Alice is having these various debates and silly discourses with the characters, it's actually dealing with things like counting by identity, counting by division, word concept fallacies. All of these things are actually in the story. And then they raise these questions like, I think one of the Red Queen or the White Queen towards the back says something like, well, if you lose part of you, are you still you? Are you one or are you two? So it's basically raising some of these same questions in a kid's book, right? So it's like even kids' books have raised these kinds of questions about counting different things in different ways.
Yeah. Also, one thing I wanted to say too is I would say this is, I mean, this is the way everybody used to count. I think it's a more sensible, like I think James Franklin does a good job of showing that modern views in the philosophy of math don't really work. But even if it didn't, like, even if you just kind of see the point, it's not clear to me like how this actually matters, because I mean, like, we kind of, as shorthand, like, we'll express the doctrine of the Trinity by saying there's these three hypostases, but they're one God. But suppose that you said, oh no, okay, well, you got to say that they're really one hypostasis. Like, it seems to me like the only theological point, as far as I can tell, that we really want to say is just that they're not identical. Like, the Father's not just identical to the Son. The Father's not identical to the Spirit. The Son isn't identical to the Spirit. Like, they're just not identical. So if you say, like, well, okay, you can say that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not identical, but you still have to like call them three. You have to call them one hypostasis instead of three. Like, I mean, okay, but anyway, they're not identical. I mean, like, all we want to say is they're not identical, but they're just one God.
That's a
Like,
good point. You get like a non-substantive
yeah, I
sort
mean,
of
yeah, it just
issue.
doesn't seem like it just seems like you're kind of saying, well, you need to express the doctrine differently. I feel like this happens a lot, like with Muslims and like some Unitarians I've interacted with and stuff, where people will try to just like get this kind of verbal result. It's just like, well, but if you look at the result of the whole thing, it's just like, well, the picture is fine, like the actual substance of the idea ends up being like just fine. You're just kind of complaining that you should express it differently or something. And it just seems like, it just seems like a silly thing to argue about.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add that like you said, like it's kind of the very sort of nature of the thing in question that defines how it ends up getting counted. And I was just going to say that hypostases are probably like the quintessential example of something that is just so discrete and so non-continuous that it's just by its very definition, can't be counted any other way than by identity. So
Yeah.
and we'll get into that actually because this has to do with nature, like the very notion of definition, right?
Well, what you're not
Definition has to.
understanding is that you have to say Yeshua. And if you don't use that, you don't know God and you don't know anything, because that's the
It
only
shows how
way.
messed up your whole fitra is.
If you, yeah,
You don't use Yeshua.
I've been going back and forth with Hebrew roots people.
Is that right?
So, yeah.
So we can talk about how this ends up working with the one man and three man thing. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's on the next slide, but we can talk about if it's on the next slide, we can talk about that.
Yeah, maybe on the next slide, it's definitely going to present the points there to lead right into that. So I'm going to continue on. So when we look at Jake and the LPT, because this is basically where his entire apologetics career is centered around, is this LPT. Orthodox Christianity solves the LPT. Jake just does not like the solution. That's the whole issue here. Orthodoxy solves the LPT, but Jake just does not like the solution, and he has no means to disprove the Orthodox solution. And so,
Yeah, this is something that came up in this book too. Sorry to harp on it, but like, basically, the issue, it comes down partly to like, what do you mean when you say that there's one God, and why, like, what is the warrant for that? So like, if the reason that you believe there's one God is because because of the Bible, it's like, the Shema says there's, one God, then you have to ask, like, what does the Bible mean when it affirms that there's one God? And that might be different from what the Quran means when it says there's one God. Or if you had like a philosophical argument, you'd have to look at the philosophical argument. But I would argue that in the Old Testament, at least, like, it's pretty clear the Old Testament is fine with referring to other gods. Like, God stands in the congregation of the gods, and in their midst, he judges the gods. Like, that's a lot of gods going on in a world where there's only one God, right? Like, so what does it mean that there's just the one God? Like, and it seems like, kind of like in the Lord of the Rings novels, right? Like, they always refer to the one ring, but if you count up all the rings, there's like 19 other different rings or whatever, right? But like, it means there's the one, the one that's over all of them, like the one that's the highest, and the one, like, he's the, there's the one uncreated God that created all of the other gods, where, I mean, today, of course, we would call them angels and demons because we were kind of uncomfortable with that language. But the point is, like, it seems to me like in the Bible, the idea of there being one God is just the monarchy, the monarchia, right? So if that's if that's the point of the Bible's assertion that there's one God, then just the monarchy of the Father automatically gives you that, right? I believe in one God, the Father, and that's what it says in the New Testament.
No, I didn't take you to be a Dan Brown fan, Dr. Branson.
Dan Brown.
You said Brown. Angels and demons, so I'm just
right.
Yeah. I can't resist the bad dad jokes inserted in. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. No, but so that's the thing, is like, it's the stuff about counting even only really comes up if you accept this idea that, what we're counting is a kind of thing, like we're counting, things of a certain nature, which I mean, I don't,
wouldn't group them together, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, if you have a philosophical argument that there can only be one being of this type of nature, like there can only be one hypostasis with this divine nature, like, you have to give that philosophical argument. But if you're relying on, like, well, the Bible says so, then you have to look at what the Bible means by that, and it seems like it probably just means the monarchy. And if the Quran means something different, then you have to first convince me why I should adhere to the Quran instead of the Bible. So anyway, I'm just saying, I mean, to some extent, it's all kind of beside the point, because it all relies on, like, assumptions that there's not really.
There's a really good point.
Haven't really been argued for. Sorry.
I'd say there's a really good points, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't, because it's funny, because you, as a Christian, you often just kind of get put on the back foot, and your immediate sort of reaction is to be like, well, we don't believe in three gods because this, but really, maybe it's more helpful to just kind of ask, like you said, like, what do you mean by God, and why am I supposed to? Why should I believe there's only one of whatever that is? No, that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you either have to convince me that I'm supposed to believe in the Quran, right, first, before we go any further, which we haven't really. He never tried to do that, right? Or you got to give me some independent, like, philosophical sort of argument or something for one God in exactly the sense in which you mean it, right? But he never tried to do that. Or otherwise, like, you're just appealing to the fact that I believe there's one God because that's what it says in the Bible. But then you have to say that what the Bible means by one God is not just the monarchy, but specifically that it means, there's not more than one hypostasis with a certain nature, which, I mean, like, Gregory of Nissa's thing is he's just like, I don't think there's any metaphysics really going on in the Bible. Like, I don't think the Bible's talking about essences and natures. Like, so
I love the idea that you might get the Muslim or the Unitarian to argue that the notions of essence and hypostasis are found in the Bible with this argument.
That's another big irony, like, especially with, I mean, both Muslims and Unitarians, like, they'll, part of their shtick is kind of like, oh, homoousios, like ousia is not anywhere in the Bible, whatever, but it's really like their argument that requires, like it's a requirement for their argument to work. You'd have to have the concept of ousia somewhere in the Bible and be saying there's not more than one hypothesis with that ousia.
Where Bible say Trinity? Where Trinity in Bible?
Well, where does the Nicene Creed say Trinity? Ooh.
Where does the Quran say Tawheed? All right, let's continue.
All right, let's go.
Yeah, so just to kind of cap it off here. So basically, the whole LPT-based apologetics rests on that faulty premise that we only ever count by identity. And if he gets you to play ball with that idea that we only ever do count by identity, then he's going to argue that the LPT is unsolvable. But the moment that you apply counting by division, then that destroys Jake's LPT-based apologetics completely. And so now what we see in his approach is, knowing that he is susceptible to this argument against the LPT, especially when it doesn't work against the Orthodox, he's now basically saying that we're inventing counting methods, namely division, or to get out of a contradiction, or we're just being inconsistent in the way we're applying these different counting methods. So
maybe I'll add that, like the inconsistency thing. So like I think I forwarded you guys these few articles about like Thomas Aquinas on counting and how he talks about the Trinity. And the irony is, like, it appears that Aquinas got his way of making this distinction, the particular kind of way that he formulates it, from Islamic philosophers. So he got his particular formulation like from Ibn Rushd.
Yeah.
And Ibn Rushd got it like because he was criticizing Ibn Sina for trying to collapse these two different ways of counting and two different senses of number. And then yet another irony is that modern, like the most recent scholarship, is kind of questioning whether even Ibn Sina actually intended to identify these two different kinds of numbers or two different ways of counting, or if he actually did distinguish them and just was kind of being misinterpreted. So it's actually in the Islamic tradition that, that you have these kind of two different ways of thinking about numbers.
Yeah, and I'll get a little bit more into detail with that.
Yeah.
Another thing that we see that Jake is doing as basically kind of like a backup to the LPT, or a replacement argument for the LPT, because he knows that he's susceptible to criticism of his LPT argument, is he started coming up with this indexicals. Now, he didn't originate the indexicals argument. He's just cribbing it from elsewhere. But the idea of the indexicals argument is he's trying to say that the hypostases have propositional knowledge, and that the Father and the Son have different propositional knowledge. They know different things. And so if they know different things, you basically have different minds. And if you have different minds, then you have different divine beings. So that's the argument that he wants to present. But as Jay did in the debate, we negate that God's knowledge is propositional. And the burden is on Jake to prove the affirmative. So Jake has to demonstrate that God's knowledge is propositional. And I think he's going to have a very difficult time to do that.
Does Jake believe in propositions?
I don't know.
As a nominalist, I'm not sure he can, but I was going to bring that up later.
Yeah, he may himself not believe that God.
What are the knowledge pieces that God's updated with every day? What would those be? I mean,
not concrete objects. I guess. I mean, what? How do you be a nominalist in?
No, we can talk about the problems of nominalism later. Hang on.
We can talk about the problems. This actually gets into another problem. In that is that it's almost impossible to actually know what Jake thinks. He's very reluctant to actually come on the record and tell us what he actually thinks. But anyways, besides that, the one example that I was going to give in terms of how even we, just as human beings, we can know things without necessarily having it as propositional knowledge. And the example is, it's like when you feel pain, you don't first form a proposition in your mind to know that you feel pain, or to have like a series of cause and effects that you reason out in your mind propositionally that lets you conclude that you feel pain. You know you feel pain absent of propositional statements because you hurt, right?
Mhm.
And so that is a form of knowledge. You know something about yourself, about your state, without having need to recourse to propositions.
But
Um,
this stuff is also in basic epistemology texts as well, I think.
yeah, and
So you
yeah,
like in Robert Audi's epistemology book, the Rutledge one, for example, he talks about how, I mean, you can hear certain sounds, like you might, like perhaps a car might make a certain sound when an engine goes wrong in a particular way, and you might hear that sound from inside your house going on outside, and you would sort of just you already have this sort of knowledge that is the case, that there's this problem with a car outside your house, without having to lay it all out in propositions in your head.
Yeah.
What's the word? In a discursive way, yeah.
Instances, yeah.
Yeah, in a discursive way. So, and there's lots
I
of
think
other
it's
ones, like
very weird. I
memory is
mean,
another one. Memory, like
yeah,
you don't necessarily have propositions for all your memories, but you'll still, recognize someone who you remember without thinking, oh, that is this person. I went to school with him. You're right. So
yeah.
yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up before we got too far afield from it. I know we're on LPT, or we're moving past LPT, but since I was flying back and I got a chance on a flight to read all the Palamite synods in the translation that is in the Russell text, they also frequently use that same terminology of divided undivisibly. So the energies are one, but they're also divided. And they're one because they come from the one God who is indivisible. So it's just, again, reaffirmed this notion of counting by division. The energies are divided indivisibly also in the Palamite synods, the same way that we speak of, the essence being undivided, but the persons being, quote, divided, so to speak.
but yeah, just to give I almost feel like maybe the audience needs to know, because this is this kind of discussion that we're talking about the LPT and things like that, that this discussion's been going on for years now. So I think maybe there's people in the audience who might need like a brief like update. Would that be like
What, in terms of what the LPT is?
just what the LPT is, what the
So
solution, what our
it's,
solution is, and
yeah, the way Jake presents it, it's in 7 statements, and it says like the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Holy Spirit, there is only one God.
yeah. And so the affirming all the propositions at once, you get
Yeah.
a
And
problem of transitivity.
yeah, and the way that he cast it, so he put if you go back and watch the debate that he had with James White, so he cast the LPT as, well, are all of these is statements, are they all the is of identity or the is of predication? And so whichever one you take, you got a problem. And so you'll get social Trinitarianism, or you'll get the relative identity Trinitarianism, depending on whether you go the identity route or um, the predication route. And immediately, so there's one way to solve it. It's like a pseudo solution, if you will, where you allow equivocation on the term. And so if you allow equivocation on the term is for each of these statements, with the monarchy doctrine, you can say that the first statement, the Father is God, you take that as an identity statement. And the last statement, that there is only one God, if you take that as an identity statement, well, that's true, because The Father is only one, and there is only one Father, so there is only one God. And so then you can allow predicative statements for the remainder, and that gets you out of the LPT. The other way, though, is that if we allow predication across the board for all of them, then you're supposedly you're in this problem, and now you actually do have to solve it. Even as Orthodox, we have to now go into ways how to actually address each of these predicative statements by the is statements, and that's exactly where Beau goes into detail to discuss how that solution comes about. If you want to say some words on that,
Yeah, Beau,
Beau?
do you mind summarizing that in terms of the divine
Sure.
energies, like the activities?
Yeah, so I mean, like so that was what my dissertation was about, like how that works in Gregory of Nissa, and it was about 10 years ago, almost to today, that I that I put my dissertation out. So yeah, the idea is just, you take these statements. So the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but they're all not identical, but there's only one God. And if you're treating those, the is God as a predication, like the Father is divine, is a divine thing. Um, the argument is, I mean, yeah, if you sort of think of counting in the way that Jake and lots of folks, would want to think about it. Okay, you just if they're not identical, if the subjects are not identical, and the same predicate applies to them, then just automatically that's three gods, three potato chips, whatever you're talking about. If they're not identical, then there's three of them. So there's a few issues. So first of all, right, if you're counting by division rather than identity, it would just depend on whether these things are divided, if they're separate or not. They're going to want to say, oh, you have to count by identity. But again, I mean, then, you get these issues of like, well, then you add one molecule to a gallon of water and you've got trillions of different gallons of water. They just all kind of mostly overlap, right? Or like a lump and a statue, right? The lump of clay and the statue are in the same place, the same space at the same time, so they're not divided. But the lump existed on Monday, and the statue didn't come into existence until Tuesday when you got a sculptor and sculpted it into a statue. So they're not identical, but I mean, we wouldn't normally say there's more than one physical object in the same space at the same time. So it just kind of comes down to that. And what Gregory of Nissa talks about is, he says it's in his view, when you use God like a predicate, you say the Father is God, the Son is God. It's neither an identity statement nor a statement about their essence. It's just a claim about a kind of activity, or in our terminology, an energy, right? And so he says, look, with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the activity is identical. There's only one act, and so you would count those as just one agent. So think about it this way, right? Like, if you've got if you've got a lump of clay, let's say it weighs like 1 kilogram, and you make it into a little statue. So the lump of clay weighs a kilogram, so it's a 1 kilogram weighing thing. The statue weighs 1 kilogram, so it's a 1 kilogram weighing thing. So if you count by identity, you'd have to say, if you put them on a scale, you'd have to say, I put 2 1 kilogram objects on the scale, right? And so presumably it should read 2 kilograms, but in fact, if you put a statue that weighs 1 kilogram on a scale, it's just going to read out 1 kilogram, right? Because the statue doesn't, or the scale doesn't care if they have different modal properties or different aspects or formal distinctions and things, this sort of thing. I mean, it just cares, like, are they separate? Are they literally 2 discrete objects, each one of which weighs 1 kilogram? If you had 2 discrete objects that each weighed a kilogram, then the scale would say 2 kilograms. But If you have these overlapping, undivided objects, then it's just going to say 1 kilogram. So anyway, the act of pushing down on the scale is identical. Like the force that's exerted by the lump of clay and the force that's exerted by the statue, it's the same force, it's the same act, it's the same energy. So you're only going to get one kilogram. So that's kind of how Gregory of Nissa talks about it. There's only one activity, so they just count as one agent.
I was hoping if we could talk about the issue of 3 men and 1 man versus 3 gods and 1 god.
Yeah, just hold off on that, Lewis. We're getting there.
Because I want to build on that point Dr. Branson just made.
Yeah, I think it's literally like the next slide. Let me see here.
Go ahead, let's finish off this slide then.
Okay, so...
Oh, sorry, just to say before, go back to the slide you had before, because you haven't talked about the last 3 points. But
the last 2 points, yeah.
But the point of the indexicals argument, just for the audience, is that if you have, because you can't have divided or non-identical activities in the Trinity, otherwise there'd be some kind of lack of unity, or so the argument goes. You'd lose your kind of point for having 1 God. And so the argument is that the Father knows he's not the Son, and the Son knows he's not the Father, or they would have a proposition like, I am not the Father, I am the Father, but the Son couldn't have that proposition and it also be true because he's the Son, and that kind of, so they would have these sort of propositions that are supposed to be acts or like energies that are divided between them, and so that's kind of one of the ways that I've been to object to that. But as we've just discussed, we would there are a few other solutions, but one solution we're just going to go with here is that God doesn't think discursively like that. And actually, I think there's a fair argument that God having to think discursively like that is actually a limitation on his behalf.
I think it's a huge problem. I mean, because Jake is going to definitely want to say that God is a se. Like that's a big, premise in his arguments. But like, if God has to have these propositions floating around, which again, I don't know how you do that if you're a nominalist, but if you got these like abstract representations or whatever, and God has to kind of direct these mental acts towards different like representations so that he can have knowledge about the world, then he's dependent on these propositions, these representations to be able to know the world, rather than just being like directly aware of the world. He has to have these representations of it.
I think to the Ibn Taymiyyah position and the sources that I looked at, which Jake appeared to agree with, also goes beyond that to even say that temporal events themselves are in the essence of God, which again makes no sense to me. So it's even beyond just propositional knowledge. Temporal events are also the essence of God, which many people have.
Yeah, but he's just trying to crib from us the essence energies, because he'll say that they're akin to like the uncreated energies in God, and so that's what he'll say is what's happening in the essence of Allah.
Well, the Taymiyyah position is actual temporal sequences and events, not the uncreated energies. The events themselves are in the essence of God.
Right.
So I mean, he's been critiqued to Taymiyyah for being polytheistic on that account by other Muslims.
Which is another big irony, right? Is that he's going to use the counting by division when people criticize him. Is that going to come up later, or?
Yeah, we can talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Those last 3 points they're just kind of contrasting Jake, what he thinks are good arguments for being a Muslim and against Christianity. That it's kind of threw it in there. The Christian response. So counting is not done only by identity. And there's the reference to that paper that Jay had mentioned, Liebesman. We do not count by identity in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Definitely, I think it's worth a read for everybody. It goes between, he'll demonstrate how if you use discrete and continuous objects, how there's no way how you can formulate certain propositions in terms of the way you're counting these quantities without getting into the contradictions. And so he's saying is that essentially you're going to arrive at the conclusion that we inherently count by division. Even when we think we count by identity, we are actually counting by division. So I'll just leave that as an exercise for people to go and read up, and then if
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
give you a few other references too, just for like other arguments that we don't count this way, or just like papers that kind of bring up various paradoxes that can be solved if you don't count by identity, but they come up if you do count by identity. So like David Lewis has a paper, Survival and Identity, that's in his in this book, The Identities of Persons, 1976. You mentioned David Leveson. So Nathan Salmon, 1997, Wholes, Parts, and Numbers from Philosophical Perspectives. Peter Unger, The Problem of the Many. That's kind of the problem I was getting at with the molecules of water. So that's Midwest Studies in Philosophy, 1980. Peter Geach has an article on identity in the Review of Metaphysics, 1967. Reference in Generality, Peter Geach, 1962. He talks about that in I guess page 215 to 218, especially. So there's a handful to keep people busy for. There's some other ones too, but anyway, that's probably
Yeah,
good.
it's not an exhaustive list, enough to get people going. The other thing, counting by division, it's found in antiquity. You see it in Aristotle. I know, Beau, you had sent me the references. I just didn't have time to
Yeah.
collate all of them there, but it's definitely in Aristotle. You have it
Yeah.
right in the Bible. Those couple of verses there, Genesis, Ezekiel, you'll see exactly there it's counting by division. You have it right within the Islamic tradition in Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. I'm going to come back to Ghazali and give it a little bit more explicit treatment. And then even such things as like the Quran. So, for example, when you say that you recite a part of the Quran, like a juz or a surah or an ayah, whatever it is, but you still say you're reciting the Quran. So you're talking about it in this like divisible notion where the entire Quran is being referenced when even you're reciting just a part of it. That is a notion of counting by division. And so some things are counted by identity while others are counted by division. And so the idea is, and we already touched upon this, understanding when to apply a particular counting method. And so like the first order, second order impositions. Now, one thing here, and this kind of leads into a point there that Jay, you had started talking to Jake during the debate, and this is this idea of separability, inseparability. And so distinction does not entail division. And so the Christian divine hypostases, or on the Islamic side, the divine attributes, they are distinctly enumerable, but they are inseparable from the divine essence, because both camps, they'll say that there is only a single divine being.
Mhm.
Now, Jake will say things like, well, the Islamic divine attributes are not Christian divine hypostases. Okay. That's not really the argument that we're making, that the two are equivalent. Now, I am of the position that I think the Islamic notion of the divine attributes in the Ash'ari school did have its development from the ideas of the Christian divine hypostases. That was how our channel debuted. And we're actually working on making a new updated version of that video, of the attributes video, which will go in a lot more detail to show the connections between the Christian notion of divine hypostases and how that was appropriated into the divine attributes under Islam. But the point here about inseparability is, in Islam, the divine attributes they inseparably subsist in the divine essence. Qa'im bidat. Now, how do they inseparably subsist? That's the mystery. In Islam, that is a mystery. Muslims cannot tell you how do these divine attributes subsist in the divine essence.
And are they ase, right? Which was the Jake Dr. Beau debate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get to that as well. But in Christianity, and this is the whole point where Muslims don't actually understand the appeal to mystery, where we're making the appeal. They'll say that we're making an appeal to mystery to get out of a contradiction, but they don't actually understand what it is that we're actually appealing to. And so Islam, you had the divine attributes inseparably subsisting in the divine essence. On the flip side, in Christianity, you have the divine essence inseparably subsisting in the divine hypostasis. And so how is that possible? And that's where we say, well, that is a mystery. And so both Islam and Christianity at some point have to invoke mystery, and it's being invoked at this level of inseparability and what is subsisting in what, and how is that happening. And that's I'm going to get into a little bit more into that with Saint Maximus.
Yeah.
And I think
I was going to say, Maximus, and also this very point is again reiterated multiple times in the Palamite synods, where you have the same terminology that's used of the presence of the essence in the persons, that each of the divine persons fully hypostatizes the divine essence without dividing it. So it's divided indivisibly. And the same statement is said about the energies, that the energies are indivisibly divided. So they each fully contain divinity. There's no partitioning or percentages of the divinity. And this is actually one of the critiques that the synods and Palamos make of Akindinos and Barlium and these characters, is that their position actually would create a sort of a two-tiered created God. The only reason I'm bringing this up is that it's applicable to the Islamic position too, because what we start to notice with Ibn Taymiyyah, and I think you could argue Jake as well, is that they actually start ending up in a polytheistic position. So the very thing that, for example, Roman Catholics often criticize, quote, Palamism of being a higher God and a lower God, and therefore a dyad, the argumentation throughout the synods flips that and says, no, actually, it's your position that's creating a lower created God and an uncreated essence of God for the Thomists. Same thing going here, where the Muslims are saying, well, when we actually cash out how we distinguish the attributes, we're actually getting composition and we're getting parts. Again, even though we're not talking about the time stuff, if you interject temporal sequence into the divinity, to divine essence, to me, I don't see how you wouldn't end up with a created God or with attributes that are parts or composition, which is again ironic because they always want to try to say that you have three God parts. But look, it's the same situation here. We're all having to give an account for multiplicity. So the question is, whose account of multiplicity actually works and makes sense and isn't introducing composition, creation, created God, right? There's no created divinity. So, but what I'm saying is that you see the mirror, you see the same problem again, sort of reflected between the critique of the Thomists that the Palamite synods have and the critique that we could make here of Islamic views of Tawheed, which actually end up in parts and composition. So the irony is that most of the time, people who are making the argument that we're polytheists, we're pagan, if you really cash it out, no, it's actually their position that ends up with composition and parts and 99 different identified gods if you had 99 names.
Well, that's the at least two of the criteria for division is spatial, and temporal, right? So if you have temporal events, then you've got division.
Yep. So let me just read these quotes of St. Maximus, and then I'd like you guys, Beau and Lewis, for you guys to talk about the man and like St. Gregory, the one man versus three man kind of thing there, because I think St. Maximus will lead right into that discussion nicely.
For that, FJ, I've sent a picture in our chat on Telegram. If you could put that up after Kai has done his bit.
So there are four excerpts from the Ambiguum of St. Maximus that I think are very relevant to the issue. The last two in particular are directly related to the essence energies distinction. So it's showing that we do believe in an essence energies doctrine, And so anybody who starts listening to Jake, you'll start seeing that he wants to basically promote something analogous to an essence energies doctrine in Islam, but he doesn't want to call it that. So just kind of keep an eye out. You'll see him trying to crib from our theology. But then this will also be good for understanding how like the multiplicity and the energies, why we count multiple instead of just a single. But so let's start with ambiguum 1. So he says, for the monad is truly a monad. It is not the origin of the things that come after it, as if it had expanded after a state of contraction, like something naturally poured out and proliferating into a multitude, but rather the inherently personal reality of the consubstantial Trinity. And the Trinity is truly a Trinity, not the sum of a divisible number, for it is not an aggregation of monads that it might suffer division, but the inherently essential subsistence of the three-personed monad. The Trinity is truly a monad, for such it is, and the monad is truly a Trinity, for as such it subsists, since there is one Godhead that in essence is a monad, and in subsistence a Trinity. Basically, so you're not going to count 3 hypostases and add them 1 plus 1 plus 1 equal to 3. In ambiguum 40, and he is known in the greatest, that is, in the unity, identity, and uniqueness of the Godhead according to essence, and as beyond what is great, since the divine is not circumscribed by any quantity, magnitude, or spatial extension, nor is it marked off by any limits. For every magnitude is strictly limited, whereas the divine alone is limitless, as the great David says, the Lord is greatly to be praised, and there is no limit to his majesty, insofar as the divine is not limited by any boundary. For this reason, the divine is infinite and transcends absolutely all the concepts of time or nature that have been devised by those who follow the technical method of logical syllogisms. Now, ambiguum 40, it's really important. You're going to see in a few slides from now, when I come back to circle and talk about Ghazali, this ambiguum is going to be very important. Ambiguum 16. For the alpha privatives or negations that are contemplated around something are not the thing itself around which they are contemplated. Otherwise, they would assuredly be among the items signifying what this thing is, as being that very same thing, and not signifying what the thing is not. If this were the case, then negations would prove to be the definitions of the things of which they are predicated, which is absurd and impossible. For the definitions of things are not based on what does not constitute their existence, but on those items from which the things exist, items which expand and explain the summary designation of a thing, which is its name. Therefore, absolutely nothing of what is said about God or the things around God can ever be the essence of God, for not even a positive affirmation, which is uniquely appropriate to God alone, devoid of all relation and detached from the energy around the thing, is able to manifest that thing according to what is in its essence. And then lastly, in ambiguum 2, the principle of natural energy is what defines the essence of a thing, and as a rule characterizes the nature of every being in which it essentially inheres. Okay, so if you guys want to take the discussion now.
That last bit is kind of famous from really starts back in like pre-Platonic like Greek medical literature, but if you're taking like an ancient philosophy course or something, if you read Aristotle's Ethics, you'll come across in the very beginning of it the function argument, as people call it, which just this idea that every different kind of thing is sort of defined in a sense by some sort of characteristic activity that goes along with it. So, for example, and the reason like medical literature was interested in this is like different kinds of substances produce different results in people's bodies, right? Like if you're applying them as medicine. so you have to kind of think the way we kind of
Also for diagnosing disease as well, right? Like,
yeah, right. Yeah, like how do you diagnose a disease? Well, the symptoms, right? So the symptoms are basically the energies of the disease, right? They're the kind of natural result of. So yeah, the way, if you want to figure out whether someone has a virus or a bacteria or whatever, or like you give them certain tests or you look at certain symptoms. If you were like, I've given you this example before, Lewis, like, if you were a chemist and you're trying to figure out whether something is like, is it bronze? Is it copper? Like, what is it? I mean, you'd see like, well, how much, what kind of electrical resistance does it have? Like at what temperature does it melt or whatever, right? So they do different things under different circumstances. They have different sets of causal powers. And that's kind of what the Cappadocians, one of their big arguments for the doctrine of the Trinity is, if you go through and look at the things that God actually does, like in the world, everything that the Father does, the Son does, and the Holy Spirit does. There's no difference. So it's, like, it's sort of like if you had three pieces of metal and you wanted to see what they all have the same melting point. They all have, they all conduct electricity with the same resistance and heat with the same resistance, and they all kind of do the same stuff. Then you'd say, okay, well then that's the same kind of thing. Like they've got the same nature.
yeah, one thing I wanted to comment on is the bit in Ambiguum 40, because it's,
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to come back again to this point about the separation and the divisibility.
Yeah.
I know it'd be helpful if Jay, you could pull up that picture I sent you, because I think that this is a section in Zakuba's book, The Rise of Christian Theology and the End of Ancient Metaphysics, and he
Mm-hmm.
basically shows how, when it comes to things like these that get listed in Ambiguum 40, like quantity, magnitude, special extension, being marked off by limits, and also like I don't think it's mentioned in these ambigua, but also the way you perceive the universal, or like the common, versus the way you perceive the individual or the hypostasis, is actually inverted
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
creatures and the divine. Because I don't know if the picture's up, but it becomes obviously relevant in Christology as well. Like all of this is also applicable to Christology. So with creatures, well, I should say with the Trinity, it's because of this famous sort of perichoresis doctrine, the idea that the divine persons are inseparable and quote unquote inhere in one another, that really sort of maintains the unity of the nature in a way. So because the persons aren't separate, because they inhere in one another, then you have an undivided nature because of the persons being undivided. But with creatures can't inhere in one another. Is kind of one of the basic principles of metaphysics, is that physical, like you can't have two physical objects being spatio-temporally co-located, like not perfectly, and so it's kind of like the opposite in that case. Whereas in the divine they can, but among creatures they can't. And then you have things like hypostases. Well, I mentioned this already, but the hypostases in creaturely natures, you can just kind of like directly see them in, it says quote unquote, in reality, as in like you can just sort of directly perceive that two things are separate. You just count them. But with the Trinity, you have to. I mean, Basil talks about this. This is why he has that passage where he's sort of like saying you can only count them sort of theoretically, like in theoria. I think he says that, or he says like you can't. We don't count like an aggregate, and that's actually in Ambiguum 1. You're not aggregating monads, because the hypostases can only be seen in conception, as in you have to sort of deliberate on the way that
Think about the
the
intertrinitarian
persons,
relations.
yeah, exactly, the intratrinitarian relations, before you come to the conclusion that there's three. and then natures also work the other way around. So in the world, in order to kind of perceive the universal, like the nature, you have to do abstraction, like you have to kind of think about it. Whereas
Yeah.
in the Trinity, it's the opposite. It's just you experience the divinity as one reality because of the inseparability of the operations and the persons.
Mhm.
So I think that that table that Zakuba has on page 307 is a really good way of kind of like clearing up the confusion that I think I had for a long time, to be honest. So it's just like, you know, having to sort of like flip your understanding, and that's, we can talk about like three men and one man now. This whole thing that Jake brought up. Would you like to start on it, Beau?
Sure. Just so kind of the question, like why you have three men but not three gods.
So Saint Gregory of Nissa, in his On Not Three Gods, he gives one of the possible responses to whether or not there's three gods.
Remind me, did Jake try to say that
that's what I wanted to say,
that we would get the result that there's only one man, or
yes, so Jake's argument is that we have to say that there's one man.
Yeah, that's an example of like where I think this is what I was talking about at the beginning. Like, you know, you can have different ways to kind of formulate the details of this, but you kind of get to the same result. So, to reference this chapter in this book again, if you think about it, right? So if you do think of counting in the ancient way, in terms of counting by division. So if you're like an austere nominalist, like I guess Jake is, I don't know. But anyway, like, you know, all there are concrete objects, like physical concrete objects, or I mean, I guess God's a concrete object. But anyway, so there's just these concrete objects, right? Then you would have to, if you were talking about like men or like the property of humanity, right? And you've got like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, in a room together or something. Well, if you're a nominalist, you don't have any properties or universals or tropes or anything to work with, right? You've just got those three guys, right? So, and they're physically separated. They're separate or divided things. So you would have to think about, if you were going to talk about something abstract like humanity, you would just have to kind of identify humanity with like the aggregate of those three concrete objects, right? And you'd say, okay, humanity is divided into these three bits, parts of the big human, like humanity is just the big kind of sum of those things, and it's divided into these three individuals. So there's three, you'd say there's three men. If you're a trope theorist, you think each one of them has, so everybody has human nature, but you'd say, if you're a trope theorist, you'd say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each have their own individual little bit of humanity, their own individual nature. And then what would humanity as a whole be? Like the universal would just have to be kind of the aggregate of those tropes, those little individual bits of humanity. So then again, humanity is divided into these three tropes, right? That are located inside in the people. So again, you get humanity is divided and there's three men, because that's, you count by division. If you think that humanity is a universal and it's literally identical in each of the instantiations, right? Then there's only like humanity just is this one thing, and it's not really divided, right? It's just in all these guys. So I think that the latter kind of is how Gregory of Nyssa thinks about things. Like he's thinking about natures as immanent universals, basically. So if that's how you think about universals, then you do get the result that just there's only one man too, right? So that's why Gregory Nissa says, like, he thinks, strictly speaking, there is only one man. And we just kind of, he thinks anyway, that we just sort of say there's three men because it's just as a practical matter, it's kind of useful. But you get other fathers who, like Gregory Nazianzen, for example, who just says, yeah, there's three men and their humanity is divided. So he seems like a trope theorist, right? And we were talking about, I think you and I were talking about this before, about John of Damascus, where he, there's different places where he's referencing different church fathers, so it's a little bit maybe hard to follow, but it seems like he probably takes that view too. I think like Aquinas definitely does. And so in my chapter, I kind of mentioned this. It's just the bottom line though is with the persons of the Trinity, even if you're thinking about the divine nature as a trope instead of a universal, the point is that with the persons of the Trinity, they would just share the one trope anyway. So whether you think of the divine nature as a universal or a trope, either way, with the Trinity, it's not divided, so you just get one. And then, I mean, really the rest of it is just kind of like, well, what do you, how do you want to think about metaphysics in general when it comes to created things? But either way, you kind of get the same result. Although interestingly, you don't get, I mean, that's part of the issue with like Nestorians and the Miaphysite schism and all that is that usually, they tended to well, I think misinterpret Gregory of Nissa, but they will talk about the divine nature being divided into the three hypostases.
But I just want to say also there's the there's the passage, like you said, in John of Damascus in the philosophical chapters where he says that he enumerates three men because the hypostases are divided. Whereas in the Trinity, the hypostases
and with the Trinity,
divided.
even the hypostases are not like divided. Neither the nature nor the hypostasis are really divided. But again, you count gods by division, and hypostasis would be a term of second imposition, and you're going to be counting those by identity. Not that necessarily matters. We covered that before, but anyway, I'm not sure if I went off on a tangent or if I explained all that.
No, we're all good. Can I move on, or is there anything else you guys want to say on this? Okay.
I don't think so. I think we.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's good. All right. I'll move on then. So now to address the one idea there of Saint Maximus about the divine hypostasis not being a monad. So the idea here is that enumerating by identity does not automatically entail separability. In Islam, like a monad, you would basically identify the monad in Islam with what is known as the dhat. It's the essence or the self. And that implies separability. So if you have multiple monads in this sense, you have multiple deities. Now, in the hypostasis in Islam, for the sake of simplicity, we'll just say that the attribute, the sifa, may or may not imply separability. And so when you're talking about these hypostases or the attributes with respect to the divine, they are inseparable. They are inseparable from the dhat or from the divine essence. But when you're talking about the human hypostases or human attributes, these are separable. So just the fact that you can enumerate something by identity, it doesn't automatically mean that you have some kind of separability. Now, the Muslim counting error that they make is they count hypostasis as if you're counting an essence or a dhat instead of as counting an attribute, a sifa. So again, I'm not saying here that you have a full equality between a hypostasis and an attribute. I'm talking about how you're counting a hypostasis. And so Muslims, when they count three hypostases, they're counting it in the sense of a dhat, in the sense of a divine essence. And that makes them conclude that they're counting three deities. But in reality, if you count the hypostases in the same way that you would count the attributes, the divine attributes, then you still have only one deity, because the plurality in the attributes does not increase the ontological count for the divine being. Which now makes me to circle back to Ghazali. And he says something very interesting with regards to Christianity. And so Ghazali says, and the Christians, when they say third of three, they do not mean that Allah is three. Rather, they say, verily, Allah is one in his essence or self, in Arabic, that, and three with respect to his attributes, sifat. And this is their expression, one in substance, jawhar, and three in hypostasis, uknomia. By hypostasis, they mean attributes. So Ghazali himself is casting into Islamic nomenclature the way he understands the Christian Trinity. Namely, when Christians speak of one in substance or jawhar, they're referring to one God according to essence or self, the that. And when they speak of hypostasis, uknum, they are referring to an attribute or sifa. Did one of you want to make a comment?
I was going to say that in the little book by Ibn Taymiyyah on the unity of God, he begins the first chapter critiquing the Christian position. And he says this very point. He says that the Christians have confused attributes with persons. So even though he's wrong, it's making the point that you've made in your video that kicked off your channel, that they derived their conception of the attributes from misunderstanding what Ibn Taymiyyah is basically saying. We can purify what they're doing, their mistake, by just simply pointing out that these different hypostases are attributes of Allah.
Right. So according to Ghazali, so the Christian Trinity is to be understood as counting hypostasis uknum in the sense of attribute sifa, and not in the sense of the that. And so counting a plurality of hypostases or attributes does not entail polytheism. And now divine unity hinges on the inseparability of the hypostases and attributes and the substance and essence, the that or the jawhar. And so here Jake would say something along the lines, or I would anticipate him to say, is that, well, the difference between the hypostasis and the attributes is that he won't call the attributes God, but we'll say that the hypostasis, we will say that they're God. And that's going to be very problematic for him, because his notion of when you say God, when you say Allah, well, what does it actually mean? Does it include the attributes, or it doesn't include the attributes? So you don't have to make explicit predication of God to the attributes themselves, but how are they conceived with regards to divine unity? And what's very interesting here is Ghazali does not deem Christians to be polytheists. He deems Christians alongside Jews to be infidels on the sole grounds that the Quran charges them with unbelief because they reject Muhammad, not on the grounds of supposed polytheism. Now, there's an interesting figure, Ibn al-Tayyib. He's from the Church of the East. And what makes him very interesting is he lived the generation immediately prior to Ghazali. He lived in very close proximity, so Ghazali would have been familiar with his writings. And he was an apologist for the Church of the East, and he specifically wrote in Arabic from Syriac to basically explain to Muslims at least the Church of the East's Christology and Triadology in Arabic terms, but not just in Arabic terms, but in terms that Muslims themselves would be familiar. And so you'll see here that Ghazali basically reflects the way Ibn al-Tayyib casts the Trinity. And here the notion of indivisibility, inseparability, counting by division, this is all very prominent. So he said, the church believes that the creator is one substance, jawhar, and he is described by three attributes, sifat, and it believes that he is described by three hypostases, aqanim. And since the hypostasis, uqnum, is the result of the essence that, with the attribute sifa, and since the attributes sifat are three, if the essence is taken with each one of them, the result is one hypostasis, uqnum. Now, I just want to make a comment here. The way that this is worded, I think Bashar Abaid, he made a slight error in this translation because it makes it sound like as if this is kind of like modalism, as if there's just one hypostasis, when he's just trying to say is that if you take the divine essence, the that, and one of the attributes, you get one of the hypostases. And that kind of gets clarified in the next statement. As a consequence, the creator is one and many, one from the side of essence, the that, and many from the side of the hypostasis, akanim.
So attribute here is referring to what we would call hypostatic property, right?
Basically, exactly. Yeah. And now, where the whole argument from Ghazali, the understanding from Ghazali would come into play in terms of actually equating the attributes with the hypostases is when you look at Scripture, and so I've noted there, you'll see 1 Corinthians, Revelation, and Ephesians, the hypostasis that is Christ, so you see him being equated as power of God, wisdom of God, word of God, life of God. So these are all attributes that Ghazali and the Asharis would be familiar with because for them, they have 7 foundational divine attributes: life, will, knowledge, power, speech, hearing, and seeing. And so whenever you would have predications in the New Testament and just general Christian usage in terms of making these kinds of predications to Christ or to the hypostasis that is Christ, Ghazali is basically understanding these attributes to be what Christians mean when they talk about the divine hypostasis. They're analogs to the Islamic attributes.
There's a similar mistake made by Barlam and Aquinas as well, where they tried to prove the collapsing of the attributes into essence via collapsing attributes into person. And the response to the Palamite synods is that, well, when Christ is called the wisdom, that's not to identify him with the energy of wisdom any more than the Holy Spirit being called love, reduces love, which is a common energy or attribute, to one of the persons. It's referring to the energetic manifestation. So again, I mean, I know this isn't about Thomism and whatnot, but similar mistake is made by collapsing attribute into person.
Right. And maybe I just want to make a note here. This keep in mind that this is the way the Church of the East formulated their doctrines. So it's not necessarily the way the Orthodox would express the terms. During this time, there was also a lot of political motivation for the Church of the East to phrase their theology in ways that are more favorable to Muslims, because what ends up happening here is, after Muhammad dies and the Muslim theologians, they start becoming more and more familiar with the actual theology of the churches. They start seeing things and they're like, well, look, these people, they can't be people of the book because this is clear polytheism. So whatever the Quran is talking about these Christians who are people of the book, it's clearly not these Melkites or Jacobites or whoever they may be, because they're believing all of these things that clearly contradict Tawheed. And so the Church of the East, being situated basically where it was, is basically trying to make itself more in line or acceptable to Muslims with respect to Tawheed, so that they could preserve their people of the book status and not be charged as polytheists or idolaters, where they would lose this kind of status. So there is a little bit of political motivation for Ibn Tayyib to do what he's doing here. Now, Ghazali, he counts by division. And this is something that probably Jake was completely unaware of going into this debate. And this just demonstrates that counting by division is not unique to a Christian context. So not only does the notion of counting by division predate Christianity, as we saw like in Aristotle and so on, but it's found within the Islamic tradition itself, especially where it concerns talking about God's oneness. And this is important not to be confused with the statement that there is only one God. Saying that there is only one God is not the same thing as discussing God's oneness. You can recognize one God, but how is this God one? And so then that's how you get in the debates within the Islamic circle between, for example, the Asharis and the Mu'tazilites, where the Mu'tazilites essentially adopt the ADS position, the Thomist position. They don't, for them, there's only the divine essence, if you will. There's no reality to the attributes, whereas the Asharis, they'll say, no, there is some reality to the attributes, and their development of treating these attributes as something real apart from the essence, apart from the that, is historically developed from the Christian notion of the Trinity. And now in his Moderation and Belief, Ghazali, and this is the text that he wrote specifically to explain exactly his metaphysical positions most authoritatively, he understands God's oneness to be encompassed by counting by division. And counting by division is the leading reason that Ghazali gives when discussing God's oneness. He leads with that. But the point here, it's not to force Ghazali's paradigm onto Salafis. And I know the mentality of the Salafis, they're going to say, well, we don't follow Ghazali. He's not authoritative upon us. That's fine. You
the
can
point is just that
reject
it's there in the tradition, right? It's
exactly
just there.
The
And
point
they're
here,
acting like, oh, it's just something you just made up right now.
yeah, Beau made that up so he can write a thesis, basically.
Yeah.
No,
I actually went back in time and told Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, like, hey,
yeah,
you guys write some stuff about this, and
yeah.
told Aristotle to write it up.
But what's going to be interesting now, I'm going to come to a slide here. What's going to be interesting, so the Muslims, you guys can reject, like you Salafis, you can reject Ghazali, but the criteria that he lists for what makes Allah one, like you're going to look really stupid and foolish to reject those points. So you can reject Ghazali, but you're going to look foolish to reject the actual criteria that he establishes. But the idea here is, yeah, that it's part of the Islamic tradition. And I'm putting it out here just to refute that pure garbage that Jake talks about, that we only count by identity. And that's a position that he's pushing because I'm just going to say it, like, he's an intellectual fraud. He's not well read. He's not well read on Christianity. He's not well read on Islam. This guy just is just not well read because he makes so many blunders and says so many things that just contradicts what we know to be the
Well,
case.
I'd like to say one thing though is that, Salafis, perhaps even if you accept a Salafi Athari distinction, it seems to me that Salafis and Atharis are very willing, like, not to negate like space and direction of Allah, because it's not something that the Quran negates. It's not something that the Revelation negates. So I think there's dispute about this amongst the Atharis, but yeah, I mean, I read what's his name, Hatem al-Hajj. He's like a major Taymiyyah sort of scholar, and he in his book, what's it called, God of the Prophets and God of the Philosophers or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but I read that, and he basically says that because the Quran and Sunnah don't negate space and direction of Allah, then we don't negate it either. Not to say
Right.
that we affirm it,
But you don't
just so
negate.
that I don't, but just so that I don't get told I'm misrepresenting. They don't affirm it. They won't affirm it because it's also not affirmed, but they won't negate it either,
Right.
right?
Right. So what does Ghazali say? So when we look at his moderation belief, so there are two very powerful um, parts where he talks about counting by division. So in one, he's talking about how to understand that God is one. And he says, we claim that God, exalted as he, is one. His being one is based on affirming the existence of his essence and denying the existence of other such essences. So this is basically what he's getting at, is this whole idea of that. So if you're counting multiple that or the what, like, so if you have a plurality in the that's, then you are introducing additional essences and so additional deities.
And
Since
notice it's he's denying the existence of other essences, but not attributes or hypostases.
correct, correct.
Whatever the Arabic version of
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly what it is. So he's when you look at the Arabic there, he's talking about that. He's talking about the um that essence, that entity, that being. Like, you can't have a plurality of that at the divine level. Since the matter of God's oneness is not a theoretical reflection on an attribute that is additional to his essence, this issue should be discussed in this treatise. And he has the following treatise where he goes on and specifically discusses the attributes. He's just saying that this isn't the place to discuss the attributes. We say that, quote unquote, being one might be used to indicate that the thing is indivisible, that is, it has no quantity, part, or magnitude. The creator, exalted as he, is one in the sense that a quantity which brings divisibility is negated of him. He is indivisible, for divisibility applies to that which has quantity. To divide a thing is to act on its quantity through separation and diminution. If a thing has no quantity, its division is inconceivable. So there's your notion, counting by division. But this, now you see all of these qualifiers that he puts, how that is setting up Saint Maximus with Ambiguum 40 for what are the criteria for God's oneness. And so basically, and I'll show the chart afterwards, you'll see that what Ghazali is saying are the criteria for divine oneness. Well, you have Saint Maximus already telling us that this is the way we're conceiving of the Trinity. And now there's another part in that same moderation of belief. So he says, it might be said, do you say that God's attributes are other than God? We say that this is a mistake. For if we say God the exalted, then we have referred to the divine essence together with the divine attributes, and not to the essence alone. The name of God does not designate an essence that is assumed to be devoid of the divine attributes, just as it is not said that jurisprudence is other than the jurist, that Zaid's hand is other than Zaid, and that the carpenter's hand is other than the carpenter. For any part of what is designated by a name is not other than what is designated by the name. Thus, Zaid's hand is not Zaid and is not other than Zaid. Rather, both expressions are absurd. Similarly, every part is not other than the whole, nor is it the same as the whole. So you see,
there you go. You can't understand that except in terms of being separable or divisible. Because the hand isn't identical to Zaid, like the hand's not identical to Carpenter. It's just
right.
They're not separate.
They're not separate. You're counting by division, but this is now more clearly getting at this idea of what do you mean when you say God? And so Jake's whole argument to say, well, we don't say the attributes are God, but you guys say that the hypostases are God, that doesn't help you, because when you as a Muslim have to say the word Allah or God, what you mean is you are encapsulating, you're encompassing the attributes with the essence. So they are part of that predication that you're giving when you're saying God. So they are fundamentally necessary for understanding God, for making that predication God. And now you're at this issue of separability, counting by identity, counting by division. Okay. And
I wanted
that's,
to
yeah, go ahead.
mention too. So just, I mean, a couple of things, like, forget about the word God. Like, if you just talked about like a thing that is a se, which, I mean, I don't know if we ever got a straight answer from him whether the divine attributes
Yeah, when you had
are
the debate with him, yeah, he wouldn't
a
give you
se,
an answer.
but again, like, if you say, look, so you've got God and you got a bunch of attributes. If you want to say like the attributes are also a se, but yet you don't have a bunch of, like, a multitude of a se things, then you have to say, well, you're counting those by division then, like, because it's not other than God, right? The attributes aren't separable from God. So you'd have to say you're counting by division if you wanted to say that. But then if you also want to say there's, 7 attributes or 99 attributes or whatever, while you're saying that they're not separable, then you'd have to say you're counting attributes by identity. So you'd also be counting, right? You'd be counting some things by identity and some things by division, like,
Right.
and
Well,
in the same way too, right? It's the the attributes you're going to count by identity because, well, they're formally distinct. I mean, they're qualitatively distinct. That's the
yeah,
only way you can
yeah.
count them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Ghazali, he explicitly goes on and he says, well, what distinguishes one attribute compared to another attribute? Like, he explicitly asks that. And he just says, it's the nature of the attribute
Yeah.
to be what it is. And now this is where a lot of Muslims, they don't actually understand the Mu'tazilite criticism of the Asharis, because when you read the exact Arabic, what the Ghazali is saying here is that he's qualifying the attribute to be that particular attribute, like knowledge versus will versus power. He says they are what they are by virtue of their that. So each of these attributes have their own respective that qualifies them for what they are. And the Mu'tazilites, they say, well, look, now what you're doing here is you're falling into the error of the Christians, or the way the Mu'tazilites understand the Christian error, or quote unquote error. And he says that you Asharis are positing a plurality of the what. Okay, so it's not that you're positing just one divine that of Allah proper with a plurality of attributes, but in reality, you're giving each one of these attributes an ontological existence virtue of a that. So you have a plurality of the what, and all of this plurality has eternality. Eternality is a marker of divinity. So you guys are positing multiple gods. You guys are polytheists. That's the argument coming from the Mu'tazilite camp, and that is one that we'll see with, for example, the nominalist position that Jake wants to go in. That's basically the argument that he wants to impose on us, but he is not, he's negating that an attribute has a respective that. And he negates this because he's just not well read. He doesn't understand how the Islamic tradition formulates these metaphysical concepts. Irrespective of whether or not he accepts or rejects Ghazali, he's being incomplete and inconsistent with regards to his metaphysics to actually explain what a sifa is, what an attribute actually is ontologically. Now, when we look at Ghazali's criteria for oneness, he says that God is one, and this is the criteria that he lists. He says, there's only a single being, God, with a divine essence. God is indivisible, and he says to divide a thing is to act on its quantity through separation and diminution. If a thing has no quantity, its division is inconceivable. God does not have a quantity, part, or magnitude. God has no analog of its kind. God has no counterpart, and God has no alternate. So when we take a look at the Holy Trinity by Ghazali standards, the Holy Trinity is one, because the Holy Trinity is the only being with the divine essence. The Holy Trinity is indivisible. The Holy Trinity does not have quantity, part, or magnitude. The Holy Trinity has no analog. The Holy Trinity has no counterpart. The Holy Trinity has no alternate. So by the Ash'ari standard,
Yeah.
the Holy Trinity is one, just as God is one in the Islamic understanding. So this is where I say that even if you are a Salafi, you follow Ibn Taymiyyah, you reject Ghazali, well, would you also say that Ghazali standards are reasonable or unreasonable? Like, as a Salafi, as an Athari, you would look at Ghazali's criteria, and I would think you would say that, no, those are reasonable standards for understanding God's oneness. And if you admit that ground, then you basically lost the ability to critique the Holy Trinity. But if you want to say that God is divisible, okay, fine, go ahead. If you want to say that he has quantity, part, and magnitude, and he literally is above the throne, he has spatial location, well, I mean, then clearly you have an inferior metaphysical understanding of God than Christians do.
But isn't that what Jake affirms as Salafi, right? I mean,
Well, but he affirms he does that stupidity where he'll affirm it, but he says like it's unlike anything in creation.
right.
It's like, let me just affirm these meaningless words because I can't actually tell you what they are.
It's the plain meaning, Kai. It's
Yeah,
just
It's the plain meaning of what the context
it's
says.
completely different from the plain meaning.
it's
That's all.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, when a 7th century Arab Christian or Jew hears of a foot, clearly it's not the foot that you would think of at the end of your legs.
Yeah, I mean so when you read like these texts in Arabic, they'll say that when they say the plain meaning, it's according to the lexicon that is available to the average Arab. So that's the
Right.
first criterion. So when you say a foot, what does the Arab speaker understand a foot to mean? But now it's possible that there is a range of possible meanings. And so now the context is going to pick out the most appropriate understanding, or what is the intended meaning. But either which way, you're still appealing to a created understanding, a created vocabulary. So you're never going to escape
Right.
understanding it in a created sense. It's just
And that's what I kept reiterating when we were going in circles at that one part in the debate.
Yeah, exactly. And he doesn't understand this. But I would like to come back to that actually, because there's one side I wanted to discuss about the problem of the criterion, and I think that's where this can really this argument can kind of be brought out more forcefully, because you were talking about how he was appealing to the creation to understand these ideas. Now, this is really interesting here. Next thing is Tawheed, because this is a debate basically Trinity versus Tawheed. So the definition of Tawheed, so it is to unify, to make something one. It is a verbal noun of wahada, okay? But the question is, what is being unified? Okay, it's different to say something is one, wahid, versus Tawheed to something being unified, being made into one. Okay? Tawheed isn't that you say that Allah is one. That's not Tawheed. Fine, you believe that there is one God. You believe in God's oneness, okay? But that's not Tawheed. That's not what the word means. Something, Tawheed is you're making into one. That's what Tawheed means. And so the question is,
it's a verb, you're saying?
it's a verbal noun. It's a verbal noun.
Okay.
It's saying you're basically, you have a multiplicity that has to be unified. That's what it is. That's what it's talking about. And this is actually Khalil Andani discussed the Ismaili understanding when he did his stream with Beau, basically along the Neoplatonic lines, but that's basically what this is. Now, the reason why it doesn't make sense in the Islamic paradigm, why Tawheed doesn't make sense in the Islamic sense, is because they actually cribbed the idea from Christianity. They took it from Christians, this notion of Tawheed. In Christianity, we've got three possible ways of understanding Tawheed, of what exactly is being unified. So you have one is the perichoresis. It's the inseparability of the divine hypostases. So you have three hypostases that indwell one another into this one divine being, if you will. There's an inseparability of them. So you have unification, you have a Tawheed in that sense. You have another sense of Tawheed in Christianity is the divine operation, so that you have only one divine act in which all three divine hypostases participate. So the divine activity is unified. And then Tawheed in the sense of two natures of Christ. Now, this one here can be understood in a Orthodox proper sense, but within the immediate Islamic context, the influence is actually from the Oriental side of things. For us, we can say what's unified in terms of the two natures of Christ, they are unified or united in the one person that is Christ, in his divine person. They don't exist. They are like inseparable, but they're not confused. They're not mixed. They're always within that one divine hypostasis of Christ. But the Orientals, they'll say that these two natures, the divine and human, they come together and unify into a new nature, one nature of Christ. And that's where you get the Miaphysite or Monophysite position. And so in the Christian sense, there is this idea of Tawheed may actually having something meaningful to it. But when you ask in quote unquote Islam, what is being unified, you ask different Muslim groups, you're going to get different answers. And for example, in the Ismaili one, you have that Neoplatonic answer that Khalil gave to Beau during that one stream. You ask a Salafi, and he's going to say, well, what's being unified here is you got all these limbs, these hands and shins and fingers and eyes and ears and all this stuff, making your composite deity. That's where you're unifying all of these body parts into making your Mr. Potato Head God. And then sometimes you're not even going to get a straight answer of what is meant by Tawheed. And Muslims will just say what the Quran says. Just don't say three. Believe whatever you want. Just don't say three. As long as you don't say three, you're fine to believe whatever you want with regards to Tawheed. And Tawheed, it's very interesting because the Muslims will say, where does it say Trinity in the Bible? Well, where does the word Tawheed appear in the Quran? Okay, now you may say, yes, you have Surah al-Tawheed, but Surah titles are not part of the Quran. So within the Quran text itself, that word Tawheed doesn't appear. So you have to say that Tawheed, the notion or the understanding of it, appears in the Quran. Okay, explain to us. What exactly is the Quran saying when you're talking about Tawheed? And you're going to get these different answers. And same thing with us when we say that the Trinity is in the Bible, we can point to you. You can look at, I think it's Matthew 28:19. Go and baptize in the name, singular, of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So that you have the idea of the Trinity directly in Scripture. What's really interesting now is when you look at the commentary of Baidawi, and I'm not sure if this even exists in English. I took it right from the Arabic, Baidawi is a very famous commentator of the Quran, 14th century. And in his commentary to Surah 5, verse 73, he's explicitly contrasting the Nestorians, Melkites, and Jacobites. And the Jacobites are the Orientals, what we would call as the Orientals. Melkites, roughly the Orthodox. Nestorians is the Church of the East. And he says, what distinguishes the Jacobites is their belief in the quote-unquote union, al-ittihad. Well, union of what? Christ's two natures, divine and human. But notice here that the term to denote the union, al-ittihad, is of the same root as tawheed, of which the latter term the Muslims took from Ethiopic Christians, who referred to the union, the Ethiopic Christians being the Jacobites, who referred to the union of two natures in Christ using the term tewahido. So when you're having
that means identity,
huh?
Which for them means identity, like the identity of the human. I mean, like for them, Christ doesn't have two natures that are sort of unified. It's just one, just
correct. Yeah, they just say Christ is of two natures, and of two natures, he is now in one nature, because they will reject the formula that the Orthodox use, in two natures. They'll just say that he is of two natures, but in his incarnation, in his incarnate state, it's only one nature that is the unification of the divine and human natures. And so it's interesting how in this debate between, let's say, Trinity and Tawheed, you can actually make sense of it and understand it in a Christian context. You can't make sense of it in an Islamic context. It's ridiculous. It's nonsensical in a Islamic context. And not only that, the whole idea of unification or something being unified is clearly borrowed from the Christians. Not just Tawheed, but this whole idea of the sifat, the attributes having some kind of ontological status apart from the essence. And this leads me now into the last slide of the counting issue. And so now,
before you go on to that, Kai, is
go
that
ahead.
because of the writer that you're talking about commenting on the Melkites and the Jacobites, that he's an example of where we see this derivation coming from? Because I could think of a Muslim hearing this and being like, well, maybe we got this principle from the Jews, and they try to, unify.
So that's a really, really good question. And this is actually a point that I'm going to be making more explicit in the new attributes video, the reformulated video, is when you read the book by Wolfson, which is, I think, just a fantastic introduction into the Kalam. He actually asks the question, the philosophical milieu of the Arabs at the time was not natively sophisticated enough to entertain this high degree of sophistication. So these ideas, they don't just kind of materialize in a vacuum. They had to come from somewhere. And he's asking, well, what are the possible avenues? And so he'll say, the Jews, that's a possible avenue. The Christians, the Greeks, Greek philosophy, and so on. And so he's going through process of elimination, why it can't be certain groups. And he basically says the only reasonable conclusion is that the development of this whole Ash'ari metaphysics with the attributes and so on is historically rooted in the interactions with Christians and becoming familiar with Christian theology. And again, it's not to say that the attributes in the Islamic paradigm are persons, but there is clearly a historical influence of the Christian notion of the hypostasis and personhood that develop into the Islamic attributes.
Yeah.
And what's even interesting is when, for example, with how it can't even be from the Jews, is Maimonides himself in his Guide for the Perplexed, he even writes that the Jewish metaphysics was influenced from the Muslims themselves, from the Mutakallimun, and he says they sided specifically with the Mu'tazilites, and he names them explicitly, that the Jews take on this whole ADS understanding because of their influence from the Mu'tazilite camps who hold to ADS.
Yeah, it's like the first 60 pages is dealing with that.
Yeah.
What's the Kalam book by Wolfson?
It's called The Philosophy of the Kalam by Harry Austin Wolfson or something of that
Austin
sort.
Wolfson, yeah, that's
Austin
correct.
Wolfson, yeah, I can't remember what it is. You may have to just get it as PDF. It's like it's super rare to find like an actual physical copy. It's been out of print for years now. But it's a very good introduction.
I have friends at the Vatican. And they're all gay.
Yeah.
And they like books. I'm joking. I don't have any friends. I don't have any
Okay.
Vatican friends.
Yeah. Let me just finish off this last slide here. So Islamic nominalism and counting, and so this is important. So Islamic nominalism doesn't make a nature person distinction. So for them, what and who collapses to the same underlying ontology. I'm not saying here that the what and the who are full equalities, but when you're talking about the what of something and the who of something, what you are talking about is that same underlying ontology, okay? Because they don't hold to universals. So what something is referring to the ontology of who that is. Now, the word that is used interchangeably for essence, self, individual, being, entity, and so on.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
So I know that when we're talking about Jake, and it would seem, I guess, as far as I could tell, most Sunni they would hold to a type of nominalist position.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that Dr. Khalil's position would affirm the reality of universals, given that it's Neoplatonic. Are there any other Islamic schools or camps that would affirm the reality of universals and not be nominalist?
I would say maybe some Sufi sects. I
don't count that.
Ibn Arabi, like Ibn Arabi, basically.
Well, yeah, Ibn Arabi he's in the Sufi camp. He's clearly in the Sufi
that's
camp.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, the Sufis they are very heavily influenced by Platonism, Neoplatonism, so they're very much more open to the whole Ismaili Neoplatonic way of thinking of things. So they would be open to those things, but the more classical Sunni Islam, it's
all empiricist, atomist. Okay, I mean, not all occasionalists, but many of them are.
It's basically nominalist across the board. So basically when we're criticizing nominalism, it really is the Sunni position just across the board.
Just to be clear, yeah.
Yeah. And so when they use this word that interchangeably for essence, self, individual, being, entity, this is how you can tell that they're nominalists, because Muslims cannot understand how, for example, Christ was crucified, because they ask this thing is, well, how does quote unquote divinity die? Well, divinity doesn't die. Divinity
it's a reductionist move constantly. You see the metaphysically the collapsing of these distinctions into just one thing.
Exactly. They don't realize that it's the person who experiences the crucifixion, not the nature, because they don't have that distinction. And it's also the same idea for, they'll say, well, Christ can't be God on account of eating food. How can divinity eat? Well, it's not the nature that eats, but they don't understand. They don't have that segmentation between the nature.
And partly this is because this is something unique in the ancient world. And this is a thing that Florovsky mentions in his essay on Revelation, where he says that you can really pinpoint uniqueness of the notion of the person, both in God and in man, from Christian revelation. So, it's also in the Turescu book on hypostasis in Gregory of Nissa, that the notion of person is very unique.
Yes, absolutely. And I have that quote at the very end.
Unique to Christianity is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And then there's that quote that I put in at the end by St. John of Damascus, which I'll get to it. And we all know what it is, where all the heretical errors come in from by confusing nature.
The more I go along, the more I believe that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so now the Muslims.
And I might add that multiple times in the Palamite synods and in the letters that are translated in this book, the phrase is constantly stressed, citing John Damascus, Book 3, Chapter 15. The distinction between nature, person, will, energy, and effect are absolutely necessary to theology.
Absolutely. So Muslim scholars, they'll quite often frame polytheism as consisting of a plurality in that, in the plural meaning the what. Now, having attributes, sifat, in addition to that, is not considered polytheism because there's only ever one that of Allah. And so what a lot of the Sunni Muslims will do is they will overlook Ghazali's attribution of a that to the attributes themselves, and they'll just leave the attribute, the sifa, absent of their own respective that. And that kind of gets you into then that question is like, well, what distinguishes one attribute from another? Because you're not saying that they have some kind of natural quality or ontology of their own. And so it's kind of starts blurring the lines of what an attribute actually is. So, but now what Muslims do, they take their nominalist paradigm and they apply that to Christianity. And as a result, they consider Christians to be polytheists because they'll say that each divine quote unquote person or hypostasis is considered to constitute a unique that. And this is now where you start understanding Jake's claim of where he's trying to say, well, we just don't say that the attributes are persons, because I'm assuming he knows that by making the claim that of the person is to introduce this new that. And so the Christian notion of a person is understood in the Islamic sense of that. So you have a distinct and separate ontology. And so nominalism necessitates that when we speak of the quote-unquote nature of a particular person, then we are speaking of a particular nature belonging to only that person, which is equated with a unique that. Therefore, according to this paradigm, multiple divine persons cannot be predicated with the same that. So what is the that of Allah versus the that of the Son, the that of the Holy Spirit? It gets into this idea, how you were talking in one of your presentations, your lectures, Beau. It's like, well, you introduce, in a sense, like a fourth God. Like the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, and then all three together are God. It's like you introduce this like fourth entity God that is all three.
Yeah, it's interesting that, when Jake is talking about predicating of objects, and he used the example of a white piece of paper and the whiteness on my forehead, there's nothing shared between these things, right. Which is, even though he's using the term white, which so even in the very sentence he's talking about the thing that's shared and saying it's not shared.
That's the classic critique of nominalism.
Exactly.
Which universals too, dummy.
Exactly. Yeah. But take that and apply it to the attributes and the essence, and then you can see how he's making the same move, where he's not understanding that it's a both and, right, and not an either or. So the point that we're making about the ability to make those distinctions in God in terms of persons and in terms of attributes and energies and so forth, we're not equating the attributes to persons, which I think he knows we're not making that argument. I think that's an easy way for him to just deflect and say, we don't say it's a person. Attributes are not persons. That's not what we're saying. He knows that. We're talking about the metaphysical move being the same. But I also think that your point here stands, Kai, which is that the very nominalist assumptions of that one layered metaphysic, you could say, of their position, just keeps kind of forcing him to do this. So it's the same thing that he's doing in predicating of created objects, that there's no shared qualities that really are shared. The same thing goes with Allah and his attributes. Everything has to be it's inconsistent is what I'm trying to say, because he wants a both. He wants to have his cake and eat it too.
Exactly. So just to finish that train of thought here, it says, so you've got the three unique the what corresponding to three divine persons. There must be three gods, hence the charge of polytheism.
But wait a minute, are the attributes unique the whats?
Well, see, and that's the thing, and that's where I think you're going to get him to kind of be reluctant to say anything, because when you read the original Arabic sources, because it gets lost somewhat in translation, but when you read Ghazali, when you read these guys in the Arabic, it's very clear that they are saying that the attributes, they have their own their own thing, or their own characteristic in their ontology that allows them to be distinguished between each other.
Well, I mean, he said it's like your essence energy distinction. That's what he said.
Well, he can say that.
No, but I'm saying that was his explanation for what you're saying. So it's a real distinction according to him, right?
It is a real distinction.
So why wouldn't that become its own that? Is what I'm asking.
Well, it would, but he's going to say it's not.
But he's going to say it's not, exactly.
Exactly. He's just going to say it's not, and you ask him why. Well, let him explain why. I mean, I can't understand his thought processes to predict what he would say exactly in this particular case.
Well, I think there's nothing to say, because this is the problem for this position right here, or one of the many problems.
Right. No, exactly. He can't get around that. Now, for us in Orthodoxy, we reject nominalism. And so we're justified in rejecting the nominalist counting of multiple the what as a supposed argument for polytheism. And Jake, this is now why you start seeing in the debate why he has to go and demonstrate, for example, that the universals, or that we believe in universals, is incorrect metaphysics, because then he wants to force us into a nominalist paradigm, because if he gets us into that nominalist paradigm, he can start making some of these critiques.
Well, there wouldn't be a nature person distinction, right?
Right. And so
it would seem very difficult how you would have that if you're some kind of strict nominalist.
Right. And then for me, then just to end on this, where we can speak of individual natures of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but nevertheless, we do permit one common nature for all, contrary to nominalism. And so it's not according to nature that the divine persons are differentiated, but rather according to the hypostatic properties. And then that famous phrase from St. John of Damascus, the reason for the heretics' error is they're saying that nature and hypostasis are the same thing. Yeah. So that's all.
It seems to me there's really, and feel free to correct me, guys, but it seems to me there's really only three kind of views on this. It's either there's only particulars, or there's only really universals, which is Platonism, or there's both, and that's it. I don't see any other.
It could, it could potentially be kind of like the same way with regards to counting. It's when do you use what counting method? So I think maybe there are times when we can use particulars and times when we can use universals. I think what the error that a lot of people make is they look at the created order and then they extrapolate from the created order and try to apply it to the divine order and say that there has to be this direct one-to-one mirroring. Like, for example, you'll say that human hypostases are spatially discontinuous one from another.
Yeah, this is a constant equivocation. It's equivocal
Yeah,
predication,
and
I mean,
yeah,
excuse me, univocal predication, which is a lot of heretics do this. In fact, there was a Muslim on the stream last night, and when I said that, the Father eternally generates the Son, the first thing he said was, the Father has no testicles. I mean, he wasn't trying to be blasphemous. But I mean, that's illustrating the
right.
point that, yeah, we're not saying that it's a one-to-one correspondence between what a human father is to a son, and that's how God the Father generates a son, like eternally, in a
Right.
biological coitus sense. It's talking about an analogy that's made that there's some elements that match up and some that don't. So there's a similarity and a dissimilarity. It's an analogy, not a univocal predication of a one-to-one correspondence. But most of the time, just like the Arians did, and you see this when the Arians are debating with St. Athanasius, or when Basil's debating with, when Basil says, the Father is the cause, the arche, the fount, and their immediate thought is that all of the predicates of a created cause are then transferred to God, and God then is this temporal being causing things in a temporal sense. And they're missing that. No, it's the other way around. Temporal causation is based on the created things are grounded in the uncreated. It's not that the created things tell us everything about the uncreated. That's the same move Augustine makes when he messes up in terms of the filioque.
That was the same problem with the Arians too, and Athanasius had to say, like, generation in the divine case isn't exactly like generation in the human case.
Yeah.
And this is what the Muslims are doing here, right? Because when you bring this up, they'll say, you're giving God all these created. They'll say you're an anthropomorphist, is what they'll say.
But saying that God has feet and shins not anthropomorphism.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's all I had on that. I do have one slide on the problem of the criterion. If you want to touch on that, Jay. I think we're already at like 2.5 hours though. I don't.
Yeah, I guess if anybody who has a kind of just a basic idea of things are being self-evident, or they're being kind of self-evident truths in a classical foundationalist sense, that you kind of run into this problem of, well, that seems to give the impression that some things are self-evident and axiomatic and basic, doxastic basicality, versus the things that aren't. And if you've got a list of things that are and a list of things that aren't, then you have a criteria by which you adjudicate these two classes. And Chisholm makes the argument that the criterion is actually that's actually more fundamental than the list of self-evident. And so actually now the things that we thought were self-evident might not actually be self-evident. So I was just trying to get him into some basic epistemology questions, given what I took to be his, nominalist empiricist position. I don't think he was really familiar with what I was getting at. So it didn't go very far in terms of that section of the discussion, but that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I'm a big fan. I'm a big proponent of arguing from epistemology. I think it's a very powerful angle to argue from. I have put up the slide there. That's kind of where I just wanted to talk, just for people who don't really understand what the problem of the criterion is, because I don't think he really kind of explained it in the debate. But I took that from one of the texts I can actually show on the screen.
Well, I didn't explain it because I didn't want him to know where I was going, so that he could try to figure out a way to feel like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that.
Yeah. Basically, for people, okay, so going back to the 1973 paper by Chisholm, he basically puts out question A, question B. So it's like in A, like, what do we know? What is the extent of our knowledge? In B, how are we decide whether we know, and what are the criteria of knowledge? And so then he he sets out three different approaches to A and B. The skepticism approach is you can't answer A without B, and you can't answer B without A. Therefore, you can't answer A and B. And so, but he's not denying that we know things. He's just saying that it's not possible under the skepticism approach to ascertain that we know what we know. The Methodism approach, you assume that B has been answered, so you can work out answering A, and that's where the empiricism fits in, Locke and Hume. And then particularism is that you assume A has been answered, so you can work out answering B. And that's where Moore and Reed kind of come in, because they say, well, it's ipso facto that Hume's criterion are false. And for the particularism, knowledge of general epistemic principles from particular epistemic principles. Methodism, knowledge of particular epistemic principles from general epistemic principles.
Yeah, a lot of like FDA's papers and talks that he's done, he's sort of reiterating a lot of this, because it's really just this is a lot of jargon and terminology. I'm not faulting you, but for those in the audience, basically just saying that we can't really have a basis for our epistemology or for starting our knowledge without assuming some kind of theory of knowledge. Right. And how do we get out of, how do we figure out whether we've got the right knowledge criterion without assuming a knowledge criterion? And so it's really an insoluble problem if you have these kind of what we could call maybe foundationalists or classical foundationalists or even empiricists. I mean, empiricism of Hume and Locke is still kind of a foundationalist type of epistemology. So there's not really, the point is just simply that there's not going to be any answer to this problem without some form of epistemic holism, I think is the point.
Yeah. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, Jay. If what I can do here, for those guys who like the epistemology angle that Jay takes, that I argue for as well, these are just some books if you guys want to read up on it. So that's the one by Audi, Epistemology. Highly recommended. Very good text, very good introduction. Another one, I think this is one you actually used in your course series. This one, Epistemology. By
the reason I like the Wood book is that he's writing from a kind of Christian perspective, and he stresses that you can't really divorce epistemology from the intellectual virtues. And so the idea that we can come up with epistemology in a secular way that doesn't have some notion of the ought in terms of what you ought to strive for intellectual virtue and excellence and whatnot is a point that, like, if you have the Bonjour book, it's good, but it's written, from a secular perspective, and there's no notion of intellectual virtues really.
Yeah. Another one, Epistemology by Sosa. Sosa is one of like the heavyweights, but his stuff is a little bit harder to read. It's not easy reading. It's more of an advanced text. A more gentle introduction is an introduction to the theory of knowledge. That's the one where I lifted from this text that slide for the problem of the criterion. Another good one, this is the last one here, A Companion to Epistemology, the Blackwell's. Okay, that's really, really good. Very short entries to define certain concepts. And I think if you go through these texts or texts like them, it'll give you a really good foundation to epistemology, to this level of argumentation, which I think Muslims, they're not even on the board. They're not even on the field. They have like no. Yeah, exactly. It's like once you understand the epistemology and how we make arguments from it, you'll just see that Muslims are not even playing the same sport as us, and they have a lot of catching up to do. Another book, this is one that we talked about on stream already, definitely highly recommended, Christian Theology, Metaphysics, by Zach Huber. That's kind of essential reading to understand the metaphysics of the Cappadocians and the Orientals and the Orthodox position. Basically, if you haven't read this, like if you're Muslim, and I doubt Jake has read this book, if you haven't read it, you're not even competent enough to engage in these metaphysical discussions. in my opinion.
I think I might check out. Yeah, because I have work. So
All right. Well, good night, Lewis.
good night.
Yeah. Well, no, be careful, Jay. No, they won't say that they all have the same beliefs. What they'll say
Well, excuse
is,
me, the same belief, the lack, like, I'm sorry, I had the thing muted, so forgive me. The question was by Cataclysm, $10. If we count by identity, Sheikh Azar Rashid and Jake, when they pray together, would have different ontological reference. Doesn't this get into absurdities? A heretical Muslim praying in Arabic would then get more good boy points than a non-heretical Muslim who prays in English. So I think he's trying to illustrate the absurdities of like how they have their own type of ecumenism, but also don't. So could you comment on that?
yeah, so exactly what he's getting at here is that because they don't have a coherent or a consistent metaphysical understanding of God, God's oneness, and so on, they all believe different things, that you're basically believing in different deities. So when you have two Muslims, like if you have a Salafi praying beside an Ashari, praying beside a Mu'tazilite, in reality, what you have is you have three people praying to three different gods. And Muslims will deny this, but no, I think the argument does stand. You have a different God. You're praying to a different God. If you have different understanding of God's oneness between these three people, then you're not referring to the same God, because then, well, what's to stop you from now adding a Christian to the end of the line,
Exactly.
Jew to the end of the line, adding a Buddhist, and what we all say we believe in God, so we are all praying to the same
Yeah,
God.
we would be back at the natural theology fallacy, the quantifier shift fallacy.
Yeah.
Cataclysm, $5. Jake dodged the question. His facade of rigorous theology is actually spineless. Once we asked about iktilaf and receiving hasanat despite having heterodox theology, Kai and Lewis can answer this.
Ikhtilaf, it just means differences. So, and hasanat is like basically like goodness or good deeds, if you will. So so Jake is minimizing that ikhtilaf or the khilafah that exists within Islam. And I remember uh, way back in the day, this was when when Lewis and Jake were actually still messaging back and forth, and Jake, I can't remember which exact surah it was, but he was at that time um, reading Razi, and he had mentioned to Lewis that there was this commentary by Razi in one of the surahs, I can't remember, that basically says that ikhtilaf is permitted as long as Muhammad didn't explicitly speak on something. So those things that Muhammad explicitly spoke on, there cannot be any ikhtilaf whatsoever. But anything else, you're allowed to speculate, you're allowed to have different opinions, and it doesn't take you out of the fold of Islam. And so that's, I think, what Jake's position is nowadays. But maybe that he's changed since becoming a Salafi. I don't know.
Did they say like Ismailis
Yeah, exactly.
explicitly reject something that like Muhammad explicitly stated?
I
But I
don't
know
know.
it's like Takfir and Islam, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there from the Sunni perspective, there are many grounds on which the Sunnis will takfir Ismailis. It's not just one thing. I'm not saying that it's justified. I do not believe that they
Yeah.
they should be engaging in takfir because specifically of the legal ramifications
Yeah.
that is entailed when you takfir someone. But nevertheless, there are multiple grounds on which the Ismailis, from a Sunni perspective, are takfired on. It's not just one thing.
But I mean, but wasn't the idea sort of, as long as Muhammad didn't explicitly say P or not P, then you just believe whatever you want about that?
Well, that's where there is some inconsistent application with regards to the Sunnis. They will be inconsistent. They'll say, well, we'll permit differences up to a degree. Okay, well, who decides what that degree is? What's the dividing line?
Because it just seems to me like I'm sure Ismailis and Shia in general, I mean, just anybody who says they're Muslim is going to say, I don't explicitly reject anything Muhammad said. I mean, it makes me think about like these kind of debates that you get with sola scriptura and this kind of thing, where it's just like,
Yeah, well,
there's no clear like Mormons aren't going to say that they explicitly reject something. They're just going to say, well, we got this wackadoo interpretation of this.
Well,
I can tell you what I can tell you what the dividing line is. It's what Sheikh James White says on the dividing line.
Well, to go to, for example, the Ismailis. So for example, Muhammad says you have to pray. Okay. And then the hadiths go and explain how you actually have to pray, how you have to do the ritual purification and the prostrations and so on. Like there's a specific methodology to the actual prayer itself from the hadiths, from the hadith corpus. And that's what the Sunnis will say you have to do. You have an obligation to follow exactly this pattern.
But Muhammad didn't explicitly say all the detailed instructions.
Well, no, that's exactly what they'll say from the hadiths, is that this is explicit from Muhammad.
Okay.
Like the 5 daily prayers, and so you have
to accept the Quran and whatever like hadith are authentic.
Exactly. And so the hadiths will say that when you pray, you have to stand, you have to bow, stand.
You have to start over if you fart. Also, Satan can fart.
Exactly. No, literally,
it's like over when Satan farts.
No. Like,
no, if you fart, you start over. If Satan farts, it's because he's trying to keep you from going to church.
You do. So if you like fart like during the middle of your prayer, if you fart, that's considered, it breaks your wudu. You literally have to leave the prayer to go and make ablution again and re-offer the prayer. Because
where the term breaking the wind comes from, breaking wudu.
And so, but then what Ismailis will do is they'll say, well, we're not negating the need for prayer, but we look to our imam, and the imam will tell us how to pray. And
so it's kind of like sola scriptura, right? Like
so it's like sola scriptura, but
it also, gets you into this thing where it's like, well, then you're having a debate about which hadith are authentic.
Yeah.
Because there again, like you could, I could, in theory, I could say, well, yeah, I believe everything Muhammad actually said, but we just disagree about what stuff he said.
Yeah.
Anyway.
BMX 1966, $10. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Longtime super chatter and supporter. Again, thank you to our $300 super chatter. That was really cool from yesterday. Rakata, $5. I was wondering what your opinion is on idealism in general. I don't know if you mean me or everybody. Is it compatible with Orthodox Christianity? No. So, idealism would be something like Plato. Platonism is rejected by many of the church fathers, as well as the synod kind of orthodoxy explicitly. Have you heard of the idealist Bernardo Kastrup? I have not. He did talks with Jonathan Pageau about his thoughts about idealism and its compatibility with Orthodox Christianity. So I wouldn't think that it would be compatible. Pookie Bear, $3. Please repeat for the audience what first order. You said first order counting, second order counting. That first order imposition, second order imposition is.
That came up. I think. I guess the easiest way to explain it. So this is a common distinction in antiquity. Like, imagine like somebody just kind of being created ex nihilo, just poof, like you're the first human being ever, and you've just been poofed into existence, and you don't have a language yet. And so you start going around naming things like, I'm going to call these things cows, and I'm going to call these horses, and these things trees, and blah, blah, blah. Those would all be terms of first imposition. Like they're these kind of like first order ground level things where you're giving things names before you have like a language, right? So these are things that just exist independently of language. Then once you've got your language in place, then you could start giving names to like words, right? Like when you first just pop on the scene, there aren't any words yet, so you can't give words a name, right? But once you've got the language there, you can start talking about things like nouns and verbs and sentences and propositions, and you can start making like metaphysical distinctions like person and essence and so forth. So those are this kind of like meta level or like second level or second order words. So those they call terms of second imposition. And so it was very common in antiquity to say that logic is a science of terms of second imposition. So like you know, if you're studying medicine or physics, you're studying, you know, this kind of first order stuff. But if you're studying logic, you're studying like how do words and predicates and things work. So hypothesis is so for example, just the way it relates to this is God would be a word or term of first imposition, because when you just kind of poof into existence, you'd want a word for God, right? But like hypothesis is it's only after you have a concept of like these are individual cows, like these are cows and these are horses and these are trees, you realize like, oh, well, all of these things like horses, cows, trees, I could just kind of call individuals because they all kind of relate to their nature in the same way. Like you can have multiple of them that are of the same nature. So that's like a kind of metaphysical term. So the word God would be a word of first imposition. The word hypostasis would be a term of second imposition. And so that's one thing, like some of the early like Arabic speaking Christians that would interact with Muslims would use that to explain, you know, you'd count gods by division, but you would count persons by identity because they're the two different kinds of terms. Maybe that's a good explanation. Yeah. I don't know if that helps.
That's good. Gary, $50. Thank you so much. Gary wins the super chat competition tonight. Death Culture, $3. This is off topic, but what's your take on Shroud of Turin? Do you think it's legit? I know a lot of Orthodox people reverence it. I don't have any particular opinion on it. I've always kind of been a little more skeptical, but that's just my personal view. Anybody else?
I'm kind of inclined to think it might be legit.
Kai, do you have any take?
Haven't studied enough to formulate an opinion. I can go either way. If it's not authentic, if it is authentic, it doesn't change my faith whatsoever. But just haven't studied enough of it to formulate an opinion.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be worried if it turned out to be fake. But
David, for $5, in the context of dissent, Salafi Imam al-Sa'idi says, as for the intellect, there's nothing in the intellect that indicates the negation of the attributes. Rather, the intellect indicates the doer is more perfect, and then it's cut off. Oh, here's the next part. Than the one who is unable to do. What happens if we take this logic to its logical conclusion regarding Allah's names, such as Al-Wadud, which is love, or Al-Karib, which is near one?
The more hands Allah has, the more perfect He is. The more feet Allah has, the more perfect He is.
Yeah, this is kind of the point I was making with how many toes does the perfect foot have? I mean, isn't 7 toes more perfect than 6 toes?
7 would be a pretty nice number if you want to have really right. Perfect. I mean, way better.
7 is the number of perfection.
Yeah. I think it's funny too if you get into like the metaphysics of perfection, which we haven't really delved into this in terms of Islamic doing apologetics with Muslims, because a lot of the argumentation we see, especially when I was reading the Ibn Taymiyyah text, was there's all these presupposes, and this is pretty common amongst medieval philosophers in general, is like there's all these assumptions about, well, we all know that, you know, this is clearly more perfect than this other thing. And there's nothing that necessarily tells us that, like, well, we know unity is more perfect than multiplicity. Well, how do we know that? On what basis? Maybe it is, but why are we supposed to think that? Well, we all know that, you know, having, like, for example, what Ibn Taymiyyah says that Allah laughing is more perfect than if he didn't laugh. Right?
Yeah.
So, David says again for $1, in other words, would a dynamic God that has these names and attributes and thus most maximally perfect, wouldn't he be incarnate? Well, yeah, why couldn't you take that, right? Like, if he's unable to act and that signifies an imperfection, then why wouldn't you go on to say, well, then if Allah can't incarnate, he's less perfect? I mean, the logic can go anywhere, it seems like, with the assumptions of the metaphysics of perfection.
Yeah, but then this gets into questions as then why would Allah incarnate? So with the Orthodox paradigm, we have, with our understanding, with rejecting nominalism, there is something that by Christ's incarnation, it accomplishes something. It gifts something to humanity, because we sharing that, like, for example, universal humanity, we can partake in something that Christ gifts to us by the incarnation. But if you're just reducing it into a nominalist paradigm, sorry, not reduce it, but if you are in a nominalist paradigm, and then you ask the question, well, it would be more perfect for let's say, God to incarnate. Well, you have to ask, why would God incarnate? What would be the benefit of God incarnating? Like, what's the purpose? Where's the benefit to humanity in this particular case? And there would not be any. And so then you're like, well, then how is God more perfect to incarnate? You're basically going to circle back to this. It just doesn't make sense that God would incarnate.
Right. Well, he's just saying that on the basis of the argument that saying Allah is unable to do something would imply an imperfection, and the Muslims will say that Allah does not incarnate, right? He's not in time and space. Right. And his point is that why would that not signify, I think that's his point, an imperfection?
Yeah. Yeah, if God's all powerful, would he not have the power to become incarnate if he wanted to?
And they would say, well, that would, I'm assuming somebody might argue, or Jake might argue, well, no, because it would require him to undergo change. You know, you would get into that arguments that Kai was making. Yeah, but
Jake doesn't have a problem with Allah undergoing change because he's in time. He updates his knowledge. Right. So basically Allah is a receptacle of accidents. He undergoes change because his knowledge updates in time.
I think if God was really perfect, he would incarnate as a 7-toed man with a necessarily existent foot.
That's what we're getting
like,
yeah.
Obviously.
Okay.
And by the way, if laughing is more perfect than not laughing, wouldn't you be eternally laughing?
Okay. So there's the homework for you guys who are good with the AI generated images. Let's get that seven-toed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, there's got to be some giggling going on. Like, the foot needs to be laughing somehow.
Yeah.
So it's like
a perfect foot.
It needs to be a clown foot, the perfect clown foot that's also laughing. All right, thank you guys so much. Really great presentation, Kai. Thank you so much, Dr. Beau, Lewis as well, who left us earlier. Guys, remember to head over to chalk.com, use the promo code J50 to get 50% off all those great products, including my favorite, the Tonkat Elite, which is proven to boost testosterone. Use the promo code J50, JY50 to get 50% off all those products, especially the Male Vitality Stack over at chalk.com. And you can follow our friends here tonight over on Orthodox Shahada, which is tagged in the show description and title. And otherwise, thank you guys so much. Have a good night.